Good evening, and welcome, weary traveler, wherever you are listening from tonight. Whether you are curled beneath blankets, resting after a long day, or simply seeking a gentle companion to ease you into slumber, I invite you to slow your breathing, let the weight of your body sink into comfort, and prepare to drift through the soft shadows of history. Tonight, we will not rush. There is no urgency here, no demands, no alarms waiting to pull you back into the noise of the world. Instead, we will take our time, stepping carefully, quietly, into the past. Together, we'll wander among stone castles and candlelit halls, through cold towers and bustling medieval courts. But we will do so as if in a dream, moving slowly, calmly, as though each detail is revealed in the flicker of firelight. You see, history is often taught in ways that make it sharp, loud, even overwhelming. Battles roar, kings and queens declare, chroniclers shout their lessons across the centuries. But here, in this quiet space, history takes on another shape. It softens. It becomes the steady rhythm of footsteps on ancient cobblestones, the crackle of a fire as winter winds press against old wooden doors, the whispered stories passed from mouth to mouth before sleep. So tonight, let us begin with one of history's strangest truths, that the lives of kings and queens, though filled with splendor and ceremony, often ended in ways as brutal and sometimes as humiliating as the poorest peasants. Power, after all, cannot keep death at bay. Crowns do not shield against disease, against betrayal, against the slow collapse of the body. And so, when we turn our gaze to the brutal deaths of medieval royals, we are reminded of the fragile thread that connects all human beings, no matter how high their throne. As you listen, remember, this journey is not meant to startle you awake, but to guide you gently downward into rest. When we speak of arrows and daggers, of poison or fire, we will do so in hushed tones, as one might describe distant storms while lying safe indoors. You may let your eyes grow heavy. You may let the words become softer and softer until they blur into dreams. That is the way of this story. So, take one more deep breath. Inhale slowly, and exhale even slower. Feel the ground beneath you, supporting every part of you. Feel the comfort of the present moment holding you steady. And know that as we move into the dim halls of history, you are safe, at ease, and invited only to rest. In a moment, we will step into the first scenes of our journey, exploring how medieval people understood power, death, and the mysterious crossing between the two. But for now, linger in the gentle knowledge that even the mightiest of rulers, those who wore crowns of gold and commanded armies, were just as vulnerable to time as you and I. And with that thought, our story begins. History, when viewed in the quiet of night, reveals patterns that are both unsettling and strangely comforting. One such pattern is this. Those who seemed untouchable in life often met their end in ways that stripped them of all dignity. Medieval royals, wrapped in silks, crowned with jewels, and surrounded by soldiers and courtiers, were still bound to the same fragile thread of mortality as the humblest farmer. Their deaths were not always noble. Some slipped away quietly in sickness, but others ended with violence, betrayal, or accidents so peculiar that they seemed more like parables than facts. Chroniclers of the time, ever eager to draw lessons from tragedy, often describe these deaths in vivid detail, not just to record history, but to remind readers that earthly power offered no protection against fate. A king might command an army, yet a single arrow could cut him down. A queen might command respect, yet a poorly aimed axe could turn her final moment into chaos. In medieval thought, such endings were rarely considered coincidences. If a ruler died in humiliation, people believed it reflected divine judgment or the unraveling of a kingdom's moral order. A burst of disease, a fall from a horse, a weapon slipping past armor. These were not random events. They were messages from heaven, signs that pride, cruelty, or folly had been punished. And so the brutal deaths of kings and queens were not just whispered gossip. They were treated as lessons carved into the very fabric of time. For us, listening centuries later, these tales may feel strange, even grotesque at moments. But here, in the safe hush of night, we will treat them not as horrors, but as shadows cast across the past. They are stories of inevitability, of human frailty, of how the strongest can be brought low by the smallest of missteps. They remind us that life, no matter how grand, is always fragile. As you rest and listen, you may notice that these stories follow a rhythm. First comes power. A king at the height of his reign, a queen radiant in ceremony. Then comes the shift, a moment of misfortune, a wound, an illness, a betrayal in the night. Finally comes the fall, the long decline of sickness, the sudden blow of battle, or the quiet extinguishing of breath in a dark chamber. But even in the cruelty of these endings, there is something profoundly human. A man gasps his last breath, surrounded not by loyal guards, but by the silence of a prison cell. A woman, once a queen, trembles at the sound of the executioner's axe. These moments, stripped of grandeur, bring royals back to the same level as all people, mortal, vulnerable, and fleeting. So as we continue, remember that the purpose of this journey is not to shock, but to soften. These tales are not nightmares to jolt you awake, but distant echoes, gentle reminders that every life, whether wrapped in velvet or in rags, follows the same arc, rising, shining, and eventually fading into the quiet. Let your mind drift with these stories, letting the details settle like dust on an old tapestry. Some of what you hear may be strange, some may be sorrowful, but all of it is part of the same great pattern. And in seeing how even the most powerful could not escape the frailties of flesh, perhaps you will find a curious peace, the peace of knowing that in the end, all paths lead to rest. As we prepare to step further into these tales, it may help to hold one simple truth in mind. Every throne, no matter how tall, rests on foundations of clay. The kings and queens we will meet tonight ruled lands, commanded armies, and shaped the destinies of thousands. And yet, when their final hour arrived, they were as fragile as any soul who ever lived. This is what makes their stories both so strange and so compelling. For in their endings, we see the collapse of illusions. We see how crowns, castles, and courtiers could not shield against infection, against betrayal, against the single misstep that turned triumph into tragedy. These deaths are not just curiosities. They are quiet reminders that no matter how brightly someone shines, their light eventually fades. Still, we will not linger on these tales as grim horrors. Instead, we will treat them as gentle curiosities, lessons carried to us across centuries. The brutality of their ends is softened by time, like sharp stones rounded smooth by the river's current. What once shocked chroniclers and unsettled kingdoms now lies far enough behind us that we may listen without fear. Think of it as walking through a dimly lit gallery. Each painting shows a royal life, ending in scenes of strangeness or sorrow. But here in the present, we walk quietly past them, observing, reflecting, never touched by their danger. The stories no longer carry the weight of dread. They are softened into history, distant echoes that help us understand the people of the past. And so, as you listen tonight, you may allow your curiosity to wander without resistance. If your eyelids grow heavy, that is perfectly fine. These kings and queens will continue their stories without needing your full attention. If you drift into dreams, you may rejoin them later, or not at all. Their fates are already sealed, and they will wait patiently in the corridors of time. In this way, our journey is not about fear, but about perspective. It is about recognizing the fragile thread that ties all lives together. It is about hearing how the powerful met powerless ends, and finding in those stories a strange kind of comfort. The comfort that in the end, all things return to quiet. And with this framing, we are ready to begin. Our path opens now into the world of the Middle Ages, where death was never far from life, and where the mightiest of rulers could find themselves undone in ways as brutal as they were unforgettable. In the Middle Ages, death was never a distant thought. For peasants and kings alike, it lingered in daily life, in the chill of winter when food ran short, in the shadow of plague, in the cries from a battlefield beyond the walls of a castle. Life expectancy was far shorter than today, and survival was never guaranteed. To live in this world was to walk always beside the presence of mortality. Religion provided the framework that explained these constant reminders. For medieval Christians, death was not an end, but a passage. Life on earth was a preparation, a trial that determined one's place in the eternal world beyond. Heaven, hell, and purgatory were spoken of not as distant, abstract ideas, but as real destinations waiting for every soul. A good death meant salvation. A bad one meant torment without end. This belief colored the way people viewed the deaths of rulers. When a king died peacefully, surrounded by priests and prayers, it was taken as a sign of divine favor. But when a monarch died violently, pierced by arrows, starved in prison, or torn down by illness, it was often seen as proof of God's anger or as punishment for sin. Chroniclers of the time rarely failed to draw moral lessons from such events. A king betrayed by his own men must have betrayed God. A queen struck down by disease must have harbored secret faults. In this way, the brutality of death was woven into the moral fabric of medieval thought. Superstition mingled with faith. Omens and signs were believed to announce coming death. A comet streaking across the sky, an owl hooting near a palace, a sudden withering of crops, all could be interpreted as warnings of a royal downfall. Dreams were seen as prophetic. If a king dreamed of blood, fire, or falling walls, his advisors might whisper that death approached. Physicians themselves, limited in knowledge, often turned to astrology to explain an illness or to guess at the timing of a ruler's last breath. It is easy, from the modern world, to dismiss these beliefs as fearful imaginings. But for those who lived in the Middle Ages, they were a way to bring order to the chaos of life. When a king fell from his horse and never rose again, when a queen's body wasted away from fever, people needed explanations. And so, religion and superstition filled the silence, offering reasons where none could be found. This closeness of death shaped the very rhythms of royal life. Monarchs commissioned prayers for their souls long before their final hour. They built churches and monasteries, hoping to balance the scales of judgment in their favor. When illness struck, they summoned not only physicians, but also confessors, eager to cleanse their conscience before the end arrived. Death was not a surprise visitor. It was a constant shadow at the banquet, a silent guest in every council chamber. For ordinary people, the brutal ends of kings and queens were not just gossip. They were reminders that even the most powerful could not escape fate. If a king, with his guards and his treasures, could be brought low by a wound, then how much more fragile was the farmer in his field? The suffering of royals carried a strange kind of reassurance. It proved that all were equal before God. As we move deeper into these stories, keep this worldview in mind. To us, the bursting of a king's body at his funeral, or the slow starvation of a captive monarch, may seem bizarre, even grotesque. But to the people of the Middle Ages, these events spoke a clear message. Power is temporary, pride is dangerous, and death, brutal, humbling death, is the final judge of all. When an ordinary person died in the Middle Ages, the world around them carried on with little disturbance. A neighbor might mourn, a family might suffer, but life in the village moved forward. Yet when a king or queen died, the impact could shake an entire kingdom. A royal death was never simply a private matter. It was a public event, one that could alter the balance of power, ignite wars, and change the course of history. One reason was succession. Unlike modern systems of government, where power transfers through elections or fixed constitutions, medieval monarchies often balanced precariously on bloodlines and claims of inheritance. If a king left behind a clear heir, a son crowned and anointed in advance, the transition might be smooth. But if the line of succession was uncertain, or if rival claimants saw opportunity, the kingdom could be thrown into turmoil. The death of a ruler was, therefore, a dangerous moment. Courtiers, nobles, and ambitious relatives often moved quickly to assert their positions. A young heir might be too weak to rule alone, sparking regencies filled with intrigue. A disputed claim could ignite open conflict, as was seen in the Wars of the Roses, where the deaths of kings and princes repeatedly opened the door to violence. Thus, the manner of a royal death was not just a matter of curiosity. It was a spark that could set kingdoms ablaze. Beyond politics, there was the matter of symbolism. Medieval people saw meaning in every event, and the death of a monarch was considered especially significant. If a king died peacefully in his bed, it was a sign that God had blessed his reign. If he died violently or in humiliation, people whispered of divine displeasure. Chroniclers often magnified these interpretations. A royal poisoned at a feast might be described as arrogant in his final days. A queen struck down by illness might be portrayed as having been punished for sins, whether true or imagined. The brutality of a death was turned into a moral lesson for the living. At times, these accounts veered into propaganda. Chroniclers served rulers, bishops, and nobles who had their own interests. A king who was overthrown might be written about as weak, corrupt, or deserving of his fate, with his brutal end portrayed as inevitable justice. Conversely, a victorious ruler might ensure that the death of his rival was described in degrading detail, as proof that the usurper was cursed by heaven. Thus, the truth of royal deaths was often wrapped in layers of exaggeration, myth, and political messaging. Omens, too, played their role. Before and after a monarch's death, stories of strange occurrences filled the air. A star might appear in the night sky. Animals might behave oddly. Natural disasters might coincide with the timing of the ruler's final breath. These tales gave meaning to the uncertainty of power transitions, convincing people that the heavens themselves approved or condemned what had occurred. The funeral of a monarch was also carefully staged to convey messages. The choice of burial place, the grandeur of the ceremony, and the words spoken by priests all worked together to shape how the ruler's life and their death would be remembered. If a king died in humiliation, the funeral might attempt to restore dignity. If a queen died in triumph, the rites might magnify her glory. Even in death, image and authority were carefully crafted. To understand why the brutal deaths of medieval royals carried such weight, one must see them not as isolated tragedies, but as pivotal moments. They were times when kingdoms wavered, when stories were reshaped, and when power was redefined. A royal death was never only about the body that lay still. It was about what came next, who would rise, who would fall, and how history itself would interpret the moment. And so, as we begin to explore the specific deaths of kings and queens, remember this: each tale is not just about a single person's final breath. It is about a stage upon which kingdoms trembled, chroniclers sharpened their pens, and ordinary people looked upward to the heavens, seeking meaning in the loss of their sovereign. To understand why the deaths of medieval royals were often so grim, we must first picture the world in which they lived. Though they wore crowns and commanded riches, kings and queens were still bound to the same harsh realities that shaped the lives of their subjects. Disease, violence, and poor medical knowledge spared no one, no matter how high their station. Medicine in the Middle Ages was limited by both superstition and ignorance. Physicians worked with little understanding of germs or hygiene. They believed in the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and thought that illness came from imbalances between them. Treatments often included bloodletting, leeches, and strange herbal mixtures. At times, the cures proved as harmful as the sickness. A fever might be treated with purges and bleedings until the patient grew weaker. A wound might be rubbed with ointments that did little to stop infection. Even the wealthiest monarch, surrounded by the best doctors of the age, was vulnerable to the simplest of ailments. Infections were especially dangerous. A small cut, easily ignored today, could fester into a deadly abscess. In battle, wounds from swords, arrows, and lances often killed not on the field, but in the days afterward, as infection spread through the body. Royals who led armies into war were at constant risk. Armor could protect them from blows, but once pierced, the danger was immense. A scratch might end in fever, a broken bone in gangrene. The battlefield did not discriminate between peasant and king. Poison, too, haunted the courts. Though not as common as legends suggest, fear of poisoning was widespread. Royal kitchens employed tasters, and elaborate rituals were developed to guard food and drink. Still, suspicion lingered around any sudden death. If a monarch fell ill unexpectedly, whispers of poison spread quickly, whether true or not. The idea that enemies might use secret powders or tainted goblets to bring down a ruler filled chronicles with rumors that blurred fact and fiction. The brutality of daily life extended even further. Plagues swept across Europe, the most infamous being the Black Death of the 14th century. Entire populations withered. Kings and queens could not escape its reach. Palaces closed their gates, but disease moved invisibly, carried by fleas and rats, until no barrier could hold it back. For rulers, to die of plague was not just a personal tragedy, but a destabilizing blow to entire realms. Even beyond sickness and poison, the dangers of accidents were real. A fall from a horse, a slip on a stair, or a fire in a wooden hall could prove deadly. These were not rare misfortunes, but constant threats in a world without modern safety. A king who rode daily into hunts or battles risked sudden death with every outing. A queen giving birth faced mortal danger in a time when childbirth claimed many lives. Power offered comfort, but not immunity. What made these conditions even harsher was the lack of privacy in royal deaths. While an ordinary villager might die quietly in a cottage, a monarch's illness or injury unfolded under the eyes of the court. Every symptom was noted, every groan repeated, every rumor magnified. If their death was slow and painful, the entire kingdom seemed to witness it. Brutality was not just endured, it was observed, chronicled, and remembered. And so, the background of the Middle Ages was already harsh. Poor medicine, dangerous battles, the threat of poison, the spread of disease, and the constant risk of accidents meant that royal deaths were rarely peaceful. Even those who escaped the battlefield might fall in their chambers, undone by infection, weakness, or betrayal. The fragility of life spared no one. This was the world that produced the brutal ends of kings and queens. It was not only the drama of assassination or the cruelty of conspirators that shaped their fates. It was also the simple, unforgiving truth of their time. A world where life was fragile, death was near, and even a throne could not protect against the dark hand of fate. Having seen the backdrop of medieval life, the constant nearness of death, the fragile defenses of medicine, the heavy weight of religion and superstition, we can now turn our gaze to the lives of individual rulers. For it is within their stories that the abstract becomes real, where the patterns of history find their faces and names. Consider for a moment the contrast. A monarch might ride in procession, their cloak embroidered with gold, their crown gleaming in the sunlight, their subjects kneeling as they passed. To see them in life was to glimpse majesty, authority, and even to some, the presence of the divine. And yet, when death came, it often stripped away those layers of splendor. What remained was the frailty of the body, subject to fever, injury, or betrayal like any other. A king might collapse on the battlefield, his armor battered, his breath ragged. A queen might wither away in her chamber, attended by anxious physicians who offered little more than herbs and prayers. Another ruler might meet their end through treachery, a quiet dagger in a darkened room, or a cup of wine that carried more than flavor. These were not distant events. Chroniclers recorded them with vivid detail, and subjects repeated them as whispered tales, both horrified and fascinated by how power could dissolve in an instant. The brutality of these deaths did not diminish their importance. On the contrary, it made them more memorable, shaping how rulers were judged long after they had gone. And yet, for us, here in the quiet of night, these stories can be heard with a gentler tone. The edge of shock has worn away with centuries, leaving behind a strange curiosity. To listen now is to walk softly through a gallery of shadows, pausing before each portrait, noting how even the mightiest figures were brought low by fate. In the chapters to come, we will step into these lives one by one. We will begin with a king cut down in battle, remembered forever for the arrow that legend says struck his eye. From there, we will follow rulers across centuries, some dying with a whisper, others with a violent cry, but all meeting the same inevitable end. And so, with the setting prepared and the stage lit by the flicker of history, let us begin our journey. Our first tale awaits us on the field of Hastings, where England's crown passed from one hand to another, and where a king's life ended in brutal legend. To understand the brutal end of King Harold II, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England, we must first travel back to the turbulent year of 1066. England stood at a crossroads, its throne contested, its future uncertain, and its king caught in a web of oaths, invasions, and rival claims. Harold Godwinson did not rise to kingship through distant inheritance. He was not the son of a long-reigning monarch, but the powerful Earl of Wessex, one of the richest and most influential nobles in the kingdom. When King Edward the Confessor died without a clear heir, Harold was chosen by the English council, the Witenagemot, to succeed him. His coronation in January of 1066 seemed to secure the realm, yet it immediately lit sparks of conflict across the seas. Two powerful rivals laid claim to the crown. The first was Harald Hardrada of Norway, a seasoned warrior king who believed that earlier promises and dynastic ties gave him a right to rule England. The second was William, Duke of Normandy, who claimed that Edward had once promised him the crown, and that Harold himself had sworn an oath of loyalty to support his claim. Whether that oath was freely given or extracted under pressure, William used it as the foundation for his invasion. Thus, within months of taking the throne, Harold faced threats on two fronts. In September of 1066, Hardrada of Norway sailed with a great fleet, supported by Harold's own brother, Tostig. The invaders clashed with Harold's army at Stamford Bridge, near York. There, Harold achieved a remarkable victory. Hardrada was slain, Tostig fell, and the Norse army was shattered. But the triumph came at a cost. Harold's men were exhausted, many wounded, and his army had marched nearly the length of England in a matter of days. It was at this vulnerable moment that news arrived. William of Normandy had landed on the southern coast. Without rest, Harold turned his weary army southward, pressing toward Hastings to confront this second, far more dangerous challenger. The march was punishing. Men who had already fought and bled at Stamford Bridge now trudged mile after mile, driven by loyalty to their king and the desperate urgency of defending their homeland. For Harold, the stakes could not have been higher. If he defeated William, he would secure his crown and perhaps his legacy as one of England's great defenders. If he failed, not only his reign, but the entire Anglo-Saxon order might collapse. In these days before the battle, Harold stood at the height of power, yet also on the edge of doom, a man whose fate would soon be written in blood. The fields near Hastings would be the stage for his final act. It was there, amid the clash of swords and the cries of men, that Harold's life and the independence of Anglo-Saxon England would come to an end. But before we step into that chaos, pause for a moment to imagine the scene. Picture the king, weary from his northern victory, standing beneath the gray autumn sky, surveying the land where his destiny would unfold. Around him, his men tightened their belts, sharpened their blades, and prepared to fight once more. Behind him, a kingdom held its breath. Before him, an enemy waited, fierce and unyielding. It is in such moments, when the world narrows to the edge of battle, that the fragility of kingship reveals itself most clearly. Harold may have worn a crown, but soon he would learn that crowns cannot stop arrows. On the morning of October 14th, 1066, the sun rose over the rolling hills near the small town of Hastings. The air was cool and damp, the kind of autumn day that promised mud underfoot and heavy skies overhead. Across the fields, two armies faced one another, each poised to decide the fate of a kingdom. King Harold's forces took their position upon a ridge, a line of warriors forming what was known as the Shield Wall. Shoulder to shoulder, the English huscarls and ferdmen locked their great wooden shields together, presenting a solid wall of defense against the Norman invaders. Behind those shields, axes gleamed in the pale light, and spears stood ready. They had marched far. They were weary, but they were determined. This ridge was their ground, their final stand. Below them, William of Normandy arranged his troops. His army was made up not only of Normans, but also Bretons, Flemish soldiers, and adventurers drawn from across France. They brought with them cavalry, a weapon the English lacked, and archers whose bows would arc death into the sky. The Normans had waited weeks for this moment, their fleet anchored on English soil, their claim to the throne bound to the outcome of this day. The battle began with horns and the cries of men. Norman archers loosed their arrows, darkening the sky for a moment before the shafts fell against the English shields. Spears clattered, men grunted under the weight of blows, and the first test of the shield wall began. Again and again, the Norman cavalry charged uphill, their horses straining, the clash of iron ringing across the field. Each time, the English line held firm, the shields absorbing the impact, the axes striking back with savage force. Hour after hour, the struggle continued. The ground grew slick with mud and blood. The cries of the wounded mingled with the shouts of commanders urging their men onward. The Normans pressed with relentless determination, but the ridge gave the English strength. It seemed for a time that Harold might hold the line, but battles are rarely steady things. They shift, they waver, they twist with moments of fortune and misfortune. At one point, part of William's army began to fall back, either in retreat or in feigned flight. English soldiers, breaking from the shield wall, pursued them down the slope. In doing so, they lost the protection of the wall, and the Normans turned upon them, cutting them down with ruthless precision. From then on, the rhythm of the fight grew less certain, the shield wall less secure. Through the long day, the men of England fought with desperate courage, but exhaustion gnawed at them. They had already marched and battled in the north weeks before, and now every muscle ached. Every breath came ragged. Still, they fought on, unwilling to yield their land. Amid this clash of steel and spirit, Harold himself remained on the field, at the heart of his army. Unlike many later kings who commanded from a distance, Harold fought alongside his men, his standard flying high. To the English, his presence was a source of strength. To the Normans, it was a target that must be struck down if victory was to be theirs. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the battle reached its most desperate hours. Arrows still arced through the air, spears still thrust, hooves still pounded the earth. Men fell in heaps, cries rose and faded, and still the struggle did not end. The ridge was no longer firm ground, but a place of slipping feet and weary limbs. The shield wall had begun to splinter, and somewhere in that chaos, destiny waited for Harold. As the long day at Hastings wore on, the shield wall that had stood so firmly began to weaken. Men had fallen, gaps had opened, and the strength of the English defense was fading. Into this weary and fragile line, arrows continued to fall, each volley seeking cracks in the shields, each shaft carrying with it the chance of fate. It is here that legend places King Harold's final moment. In the famous story, an arrow arched through the sky and found its mark, striking Harold in the eye. Chroniclers who lived after the battle described this moment with solemnity, as if it were not just a death, but a symbol. To be pierced in the eye, the very organ of sight, was to be struck blind in the moment of his fall, as though destiny itself had chosen the cruelest path. The tale is immortalized in the Bayeux Tapestry, stitched decades later in vivid thread. In one panel, a figure reaches toward his face, an arrow jutting from the eye. Above him, the inscription reads, "Harold the King." It is one of the most enduring images of the Middle Ages, repeated in countless histories and retellings. And yet, like many stories of the past, it is not so simple. Some accounts suggest that Harold may not have died from an arrow at all. Instead, he may have been struck down by Norman knights who pressed into the broken shield wall. One chronicler writes that he was cut down with sword and axe, his body mutilated as the enemy sought to ensure his death beyond all doubt. The arrow, perhaps, was added later, a symbol more dramatic, more memorable than a simple fall to steel. Still, whether fact or embellishment, the arrow legend endured because it carried weight. To those who believed it, the arrow was no accident. It was divine judgment, punishment for Harold's broken oath to William, or for his pride in seizing the throne. To later storytellers, the image of a king undone in such a striking way was too powerful to forget. Imagine, for a moment, the scene as it was told. The weary king, standing beneath the gray autumn sky, his men falling around him, his breath heavy, his vision blurred from fatigue. Suddenly, an arrow arcs above the clash, descending in silence before striking its mark. The king staggers, reaches for his face, and falls. Around him, the English line falters further, hope slipping away with their sovereign's last breath. It may not matter, in the end, whether this was precisely how Harold died. The truth of battle is often lost in the dust and blood of its chaos. What survives are the stories, shaped by those who lived after, each adding their own meaning. The arrow became the emblem of Harold's fall, a single moment that symbolized the collapse of Anglo-Saxon rule in England. For those of us looking back across the centuries, the story is less about cruelty and more about inevitability. A man who rose quickly to the throne, who defended his land with bravery, was brought down in the swirl of forces greater than himself. The arrow, whether real or imagined, represents the suddenness of fate, the way power can vanish in an instant. And so, when we recall Harold's end, we need not argue over the details of weapon and wound. Instead, We may see it as the people of the Middle Ages saw it, a sign, a symbol, a story carried through time, a king undone not just by steel, but by destiny itself. When Harold fell upon the field of Hastings, whether by arrow or by blade, his death was more than the loss of a man. It was the closing of an age. With his final breath, the line of Anglo-Saxon kings that had ruled England for centuries came to an end, and a new chapter began under Norman rule. The battle did not end instantly with Harold's fall, but his death was the turning point. The English fought on with grim determination, but without their king, their cause weakened. As the sun dipped lower, William's forces pressed harder, and by nightfall the field belonged to the Normans. The ridge that had been Harold's stronghold was littered with bodies, the shield wall broken forever. In the days that followed, Harold's body was said to have been mangled beyond recognition. Some accounts claim that his mistress, Edith the Fair, was brought to identify him by marks only she could know. Others suggest his remains were so disfigured that doubt lingered over the exact spot where the fallen king lay. Legends even arose that Harold survived and lived out his days in quiet obscurity. But such tales were more comfort than truth. History holds that the last Anglo-Saxon king was buried without grandeur, his kingdom already passing to the hands of his conqueror. William of Normandy, soon to be called William the Conqueror, seized the crown. His victory at Hastings marked not only a change of rulers, but a transformation of the entire nation. Castles of stone began to rise where wooden halls once stood. French words seeped into the English tongue. Laws, customs, and hierarchies shifted as the Normans reshaped the land to their will. Harold's death was the threshold, the moment one England ended and another began. For the people of the time, Harold's brutal fate carried layers of meaning. To his supporters, he was a brave king who defended his homeland to the last, cut down in the chaos of battle. To his enemies, his fall was divine justice, proof that William's claim was righteous and blessed by God. Chroniclers wrote accordingly, their pens shaping Harold's image for generations. Centuries later, historians still debate the details of his final hour, but what endures is the symbol. Harold's death became the emblem of fragility, how swiftly power could be stripped away, how even a king could be reduced to a broken body on a field of mud. The arrow in the eye, whether truth or myth, captured the imagination of the ages because it crystallized that fragility in a single, unforgettable image. For us, looking back now, the story of Harold's death is less a tale of gore and more a quiet reminder of change. It shows how the fate of one man can alter the destiny of a whole nation. It shows how crowns and oaths, armies and battles can be swept aside in a single day. And it shows how even the most powerful figures are subject to the same final silence. As you rest and listen, let the story of Harold settle softly in your mind. A king, proud and weary, standing on a ridge beneath the autumn sky. An arrow, or a sword, finding its mark. A crown falling, a kingdom shifting, and history turning its page. In the end, Harold's death was brutal. Yes, but it was also inevitable. The fragile conclusion to a fragile reign. And with his passing, we stepped forward to the next tale. Another ruler, another throne, another life ended in strangeness and sorrow. For Harold was only the first in our journey through the brutal deaths of medieval royals. Harold's fall at Hastings was not only the death of a king, it was the death of a way of life. His brutal end opened the door to an entirely new order, one that would change the culture, language, and very identity of England for centuries to come. The most visible change came through power and land. William of Normandy, now crowned as king, claimed not only Harold's throne, but the lands of those who had stood against him. Vast estates were stripped from Anglo-Saxon nobles and granted to Norman lords who had fought at his side. The old aristocracy, rooted in centuries of English tradition, was swept away almost overnight. In its place arose a new elite, bound to William through loyalty and blood. Castles, too, began to rise across the land. Where once stood wooden halls and scattered fortifications, the Normans built massive stone keeps. These were not only military strongholds, but symbols of domination. Each new castle cast its shadow across the countryside, a constant reminder to the English that their world had changed. The landscape itself bore witness to the consequences of Harold's fall. Language shifted as well. The court, once Anglo-Saxon in tongue, now spoke Norman French. Over time, this language mingled with Old English, giving birth to the early form of English we recognize today. Words of power, law, and governance often came from French, while the older English words remained rooted in the language of the fields and hearths. Harold's death, therefore, echoed even in speech, reshaping the very words people used to describe their world. Law and governance were transformed. William ordered surveys of land and wealth, the most famous being the Domesday Book, a record that sought to measure and control the kingdom in unprecedented detail. The Anglo-Saxon system of local lords and councils gave way to Norman feudalism, with ties of loyalty drawn tightly around the crown. Harold's death had not just changed the throne, it had altered the structure of rule itself. For the common people, the consequences were slower, but no less real. Heavy taxes, new lords, and the loss of familiar customs marked the years that followed. Resistance flickered here and there, but each rebellion was crushed. The memory of Harold's last stand at Hastings became for some a symbol of what was lost, a moment of defiance swallowed by conquest. And yet, out of this upheaval, a New England emerged, one that blended Saxon and Norman, one that would, in time, become a kingdom stronger and more unified than before. Harold's death, though brutal and humiliating, had cleared the way for transformations that would shape not just England, but the future of Europe. It is remarkable to think that a single day, a single fall on a muddy battlefield, could ripple outward so far. But this is the weight of royal deaths in the Middle Ages. They were never isolated endings. They were turning points, moments when kingdoms shifted and destinies bent. And so, as we leave Harold behind, we do so with the knowledge that his brutal end was more than a personal tragedy. It was the closing of one world and the opening of another. His crown, fallen in the dirt, did not simply vanish. It was picked up, carried forward, and used to reshape an entire realm. When history remembers William of Normandy, it usually paints him in strokes of power and triumph. He was the man who crossed the Channel with a fleet of ships, defeated Harold at Hastings, and seized the crown of England. He ruled with determination, reshaping the kingdom through castles, laws, and a firm grip on his new subjects. To many, he was William the Conqueror, a figure of might, ambition, and endurance. And yet, like so many rulers of the Middle Ages, his end was far from the glory of his life. In the year 1087, William was no longer the vigorous duke who had stormed across England 2 decades earlier. Age and the burdens of rule had weighed on him. His body, once hardened by campaigns, had grown heavy. Chroniclers describe him as stout, his form bearing the signs of a man accustomed to feasting and the comforts of kingship. But still, his temper and ambition had not waned. That year, William turned his attention to France, where conflict with King Philip I drew him once more into battle. Though older and less nimble than in his youth, William still led his men into the field. It was during the siege of the French town of Mons that fate intervened. Accounts vary in detail, but the most widely repeated story tells of William's horse stumbling as it carried him across rough ground. The saddle struck hard against his body, crushing his abdomen. At first, the injury may not have seemed mortal, but as days passed, infection set in. His stomach grew swollen and painful, his strength drained, and his once commanding voice fell into weakness. The conqueror, who had stood tall above England, now lay helpless in a chamber, struggling for breath. Chroniclers linger on the irony. This was a man who had toppled kingdoms, yet he was undone not by an enemy's sword, but by the stumble of his own horse. No great warrior struck him down. No arrow pierced his chest in the clash of armies. Instead, he was felled by a mundane accident, a reminder that no crown could shield its wearer from the frailty of flesh. As his decline worsened, William was carried to the priory of Saint-Gervais in Rouen, where he lingered for weeks. The halls that once rang with the voices of courtiers and commanders now echoed with prayers and hushed whispers of monks. Physicians, powerless in the face of his injury, could offer no relief. His belly swelled grotesquely, his pain mounting each day, until the conqueror lay in misery, stripped of dignity. In those final days, William was said to have confessed his sins, sought forgiveness, and attempted to set his affairs in order. He granted lands to the church, gave instructions for his burial, and divided his dominions among his sons, Normandy to Robert, England to William Rufus. Yet even in this, there was tension, for his sons quarreled, and his arrangements sowed discord that would flare into conflict after his death. The scene was far from the image of a triumphant king. Instead of ending his reign with the roar of victory, William dwindled in slow agony, his body betraying him more each day. Those who recorded his passing saw in it a lesson. The mighty may rise, but pride and power cannot conquer mortality. On September 9th, 1087, William the Conqueror breathed his last. The conqueror of England, the duke who had reshaped Europe, passed not on a battlefield, but on a narrow bed, undone by the weight of his own body and the stumble of a horse. His death was not noble, not glorious, but humiliating. And it was only the beginning of the indignities that would follow. The accident at Monte was sudden, yet its consequences stretched into weeks of torment. Chroniclers describe how William's horse stumbled on uneven ground, or perhaps on the burning rubble of the besieged town. The heavy saddle drove sharply into his abdomen, tearing at muscles and crushing organs. At first, it may have seemed no worse than a painful blow, the sort that a hardened soldier might endure. But within days, the truth emerged. This was no simple wound. His body began to swell, his belly distended with fluid and infection. What had been a proud, commanding frame now became grotesque and fragile. The conqueror, once feared across kingdoms, lay confined to his bed, each movement agony. He could not ride. could not walk unaided, and could barely eat. The man who had once thundered across battlefields now struggled for breath in a narrow chamber. In Rouen, he was carried to the priory of Saint-Gervais, a place of prayer and quiet stone walls. Monks tended to him, chanting softly while physicians attempted their remedies. But in the 11th century, medicine offered little to ease such injuries. Bloodletting, poultices, and herbal concoctions were applied, yet none could relieve his pain. The swelling grew worse, his skin tight, his body betraying him more each day. As he lingered, William was forced to confront what few conquerors ever wished to face: helplessness. He had commanded armies, toppled thrones, reshaped nations. Now, he could not command even his own body. Chroniclers noted the irony with almost moral satisfaction. The conqueror, reduced to misery, humbled before death. During these weeks, William is said to have turned his thoughts to repentance. He confessed sins, acknowledged the harshness of his reign, and attempted to make peace with God. He ordered gifts to the church, hoping to cleanse his conscience through acts of piety. He divided his possessions and kingdoms among his sons, though even this last act sowed discord, for rivalry brewed between his heirs. Around his bed, the atmosphere was tense. Courtiers whispered, knowing that the king's death would soon open struggles for power. Messengers prepared to carry news across Normandy and England. Even in the chamber of a dying man, ambition and calculation stirred. The conqueror's final hours were not filled with peace, but with the uneasy rustle of politics already moving to replace him. The physical decline itself was brutal. Each day his body grew weaker, the swelling more grotesque. The wound, untreated and festering, spread corruption through his flesh. The pain must have been unbearable, yet accounts tell of him enduring it with grim silence, broken by groans and murmurs of prayer. His bed became both his battlefield and his prison, where the greatest ruler of his age lay conquered by his own injury. At last, on the 9th of September, 1087, William the Conqueror gave up his struggle. His breath faded, his voice fell silent, and the conqueror of England was no more. The chamber that had witnessed his decline now stood still, filled with the uneasy quiet that follows the death of power. His attendants crossed themselves, the monks prayed, and his courtiers turned swiftly to the business of what came next. The manner of his death left a lasting impression. It was not the heroic fall of a warrior king, struck in battle, but the drawn-out collapse of a body broken by an accident. Chroniclers saw in this humiliation a kind of justice. The man who had conquered with pride, who had ruled with iron severity, was brought low, not by armies or assassins, but by his own weight, his own horse, and the slow corruption of flesh. The conqueror had been conquered at last. Death did not grant William the Conqueror dignity. If anything, the days after his passing deepened the humiliation that had marked his decline. Even in death, his body seemed to rebel against him, and the final image that history preserved was not of a noble king laid to rest, but of a swollen corpse, bursting in the very church that was meant to honor him. When William died in Rouen, his body was prepared for burial. But times were troubled, and political urgency pressed heavily upon those who had served him. His sons were already quarreling over his inheritance. Courtiers were eager to secure their own positions, and the monks who oversaw his remains were left with the practical task of handling a body in the late summer heat, transporting the king's corpse to Caen, where he was to be buried at the Abbey of Saint-Étienne, was no easy task. His body, already swollen from the injuries and infection that had killed him, grew worse with every passing day. By the time it arrived, the stench was overpowering. Chroniclers describe attendants struggling to prepare the body, trying to clothe and place him in a coffin that proved too small for his enlarged form. The day of the funeral was meant to be solemn, but even before it began, troubles arose. Local men claimed that the land on which the abbey stood had been unjustly seized from them, and they halted the ceremony until their grievances were addressed. The conqueror, who had claimed entire kingdoms, now lay helpless, his burial delayed by disputes over a patch of earth. When at last the body was lowered into the tomb, disaster struck. The coffin was too tight, the swollen corpse resisted, and in the struggle to place him within, William's body burst. A terrible odor filled the church, forcing mourners to recoil. What should have been a moment of reverence dissolved into chaos and disgust. Priests hurried to complete the rites. Monks waved incense to cover the stench, and the ceremony limped forward under a shadow of shame. For those who recorded the event, the scene carried deep symbolic weight. This was William the Conqueror, the man who had crushed Harold at Hastings, who had reshaped England, who had bent nobles and nations to his will. And yet, in death, his body offered nothing but frailty and ruin. The conqueror, who had seemed larger than life, was reduced to a grotesque spectacle, his pride humbled before all. Chroniclers, ever eager to teach lessons, emphasized the irony. The man who had filled lands with castles, who had forced his enemies into submission, could not even control his own remains. His bursting body became a warning. Pride is fleeting, power is fragile, and in the end, even kings rot like all men. For those present, the memory of that day must have lingered. The odor clinging to robes, the sight of priests fumbling to continue their prayers, the realization that greatness cannot shield against decay. For us, centuries later, the story reads almost like a parable, softened by time, but still vivid in its strange humiliation. The conqueror had been undone twice, once by the accident that took his life, and again by the indignity of his burial. His name endured in history, but not without this stain, this reminder that even the mightiest of rulers must surrender to the most humbling truths of mortality. The strange and humiliating end of William the Conqueror was more than an anecdote for chroniclers. In the Middle Ages, death was not seen as a mere biological conclusion, but as a moral stage, a final act that revealed truth about a person's life and character. The manner of death spoke louder than words, and William's end was interpreted as a parable of pride, power, and the certainty of mortality. Here was a man who had risen higher than almost any of his age. Born the illegitimate son of a duke, William had fought to secure his place in Normandy, survived assassination attempts, defeated rivals, and expanded his rule across the sea to seize England. His reign was marked by strength, ambition, and a determination to leave his mark on the world. He succeeded, but his death showed that no mark, no matter how bold, can outlast the inevitability of decay. Chroniclers did not miss the irony. They described with detail how the conqueror was undone not by an enemy's blade, but by his own body, bloated and broken. They lingered on the image of his funeral, the bursting corpse filling the church with stench. the prayers of priests disrupted by the raw evidence of mortality. To them, it was a moral lesson. Pride may rise high, but it must always fall. For medieval audiences, such tales were not meant only to horrify, but to instruct. They reinforced the Christian belief that earthly power was fleeting, and that all men, no matter their crowns or victories, must stand equal before God in death. William, who had seized kingdoms, could not seize control of his final hour. The conqueror had been conquered at last, not by men, but by the truth of human frailty. In this way, his death became more than personal humiliation. It became a symbol. Later writers and historians, reflecting on his life, often saw his end as the balance to his triumphs. He had risen so high that his fall had to be equally striking. A simple, quiet death would not have carried the same weight. Instead, fate gave him an end that echoed with meaning, the mightiest ruler reduced to a grotesque reminder of the body's weakness. Yet for us, centuries later, the story can be read with a gentler tone. The harsh judgments of chroniclers soften into curiosity, the grotesque detail into something more symbolic. His bursting body no longer shocks us into fear, but reminds us of what we already know. That time humbles all, that strength fades, and that mortality spares no one. Kings and peasants alike return to the same silence, no matter the path they walked in life. And so, William's death is remembered not only as an oddity, but as a mirror. It reflects back the truth that power cannot grant immortality. The castles he built, the lands he conquered, the laws he imposed, all endured, yet his own body failed him in the most humiliating way. Pride, in the end, was no defense. As we leave William behind, we do so with this image lingering, a conqueror who could not conquer death. His story reminds us that history's greatest figures, however mighty, remain bound by the same threads as every soul. It is this reminder, softened by the centuries, that makes the tale both brutal and strangely comforting. For in seeing William's fall, we glimpse our shared humanity, the humbling truth that in the end, all are equal. The reign of Edward II of England began with promise. He was the son of Edward I, the formidable Hammer of the Scots, a king remembered for his stern command and towering presence. When Edward II inherited the throne in 1307, hopes ran high that he would continue the legacy of strength and conquest. But the younger Edward was not his father. Where Edward I had been firm and relentless, his son was more indulgent, more easily swayed, and far less suited to the ruthless demands of kingship. From the start, his reign was clouded by controversy. He surrounded himself with favorites, most notably Piers Gaveston, whose influence over the king stirred resentment among the barons. Gaveston's arrogance and Edward's favoritism led to open hostility, ending in Gaveston's execution by rebellious nobles. Yet Edward did not learn caution. Later, his affection transferred to the Despencer family, Hugh Despencer the Younger and his father, whose greed and power only deepened the king's unpopularity. Discontent spread across the realm. Nobles who felt dishonored by the Despencer's rise turned against the king. Even Edward's queen, Isabella of France, grew estranged, humiliated by the Despensers and embittered by her husband's failures. When Edward's rule faltered, Isabella found her moment. In 1326, she joined forces with Roger Mortimer, her lover and ally, raising an army that marched into England to depose the king. Edward fled, desperate to rally support, but his cause had withered. Betrayed by those who once swore loyalty, he was captured and forced to abdicate in favor of his young son, Edward III. The mighty crown that had once gleamed on his head was now passed to a boy, while the deposed king found himself stripped of dignity, locked away in captivity. At first, Edward was held under guard in various castles. Though still treated as a former monarch, his freedom was gone. The Despensers, his closest allies, met grim fates. Hugh Despenser the Younger, executed in horrific fashion, his body dismembered as a warning to others. Edward must have watched his world unravel, his friends destroyed, his wife turned enemy, and his throne lost forever. Imprisonment for a king was unlike that of ordinary men. The stone walls of Berkeley Castle, where Edward was eventually confined, were not merely barriers of rock. They were barriers of trust, of silence, of betrayal. Guards whispered in the corridors, servants moved with unease, and the once king, now reduced to a prisoner, lived in the shadow of uncertainty. There was no trial, no official sentence. His enemies did not dare risk a public execution, for killing a crowned king outright carried dangerous implications. Instead, Edward lingered in the half-light of captivity, his fate undecided, his life a thread held between politics and vengeance. Chroniclers describe his confinement as miserable. The damp of stone walls, the chill of English nights, the knowledge that he had been abandoned by those who once bowed before him. For Edward, the fall must have been devastating. He who had once sat upon a throne now waited on the will of jailers. He who had once commanded armies now listened for the scrape of keys in the lock, unsure whether they signaled food, a guard's visit, or the beginning of the end. And in the silence of his prison, rumors began to grow. Rumors of torture, of plots to ensure he would never return, of whispered plans for a death so secret and so brutal that it would erase him quietly from the stage of power. The walls of Berkeley Castle, where Edward was held, still stand today, thick, gray, and unyielding. In the 14th century, they were colder still, their stones damp with rain and shadowed by the weight of secrecy. Within those walls, the once crowned king lived as a captive, his days marked by uncertainty, his nights broken by whispers in the dark. Accounts from chroniclers tell us that his confinement was deliberately harsh. Some describe how his guards were instructed to make his stay as miserable as possible, depriving him of comfort, cutting him off from news, and ensuring he felt the full humiliation of defeat. His enemies wished not only to remove him from power, but to break his spirit entirely. Rumors of cruelty spread quickly. There were whispers that he was starved, denied warmth, or even tormented by the sounds of discordant music played outside his cell to drive him into despair. Whether these details are true or not, they reflect the atmosphere of dread surrounding his captivity. For Edward, every day must have felt like a slow erosion of dignity, a reminder that he was no longer king, but a prisoner at the mercy of those who hated him. And then, the darkest rumor of all, the tale of his execution. According to some chroniclers, Edward's death was not simple. It was not a sword stroke or a poison in his cup. Instead, they wrote that he was killed with deliberate cruelty, a red-hot poker thrust into his body through a horn, leaving no outward mark, but burning him from within. The horror of this image has echoed for centuries. staining Edward's memory with one of the most infamous deaths ever described in medieval history. But was it true? Here lies the puzzle. The story of the poker emerges from hostile accounts written years later, often by chroniclers eager to depict his fall as both shameful and fitting. Some historians believe the tale was propaganda, intended to mock Edward, whose enemies often accused him of weakness and effeminacy. By assigning him such a grotesque death, they may have sought to tarnish his legacy forever, ensuring that even his final moments carried the weight of ridicule. Others argue that the method, while shocking, may indeed have been chosen precisely because it left no external wounds. Killing a deposed king was dangerous. It could provoke rebellion or claims of martyrdom. A death with no obvious signs might allow his captors to claim he had died naturally. In this way, the bizarre method of execution, however unlikely, carried a grim logic in the brutal politics of the time. Whether real or imagined, the rumor spread widely. Chroniclers repeated it, artists illustrated it, and over the centuries, the story became part of Edward's legend. In the dim silence of his prison cell, whether by starvation, suffocation, or the cruel fire of the tale, Edward met his end in September 1327. His enemies ensured that his death, like his reign, was overshadowed by humiliation. Imagine the atmosphere of those last moments, however they came. The chill of the stone chamber, the flicker of torchlight against the walls, the sound of boots on the floor, the creak of a door opening, the approach of men whose faces betrayed no kindness. Edward, once a king, now powerless, waiting for what he surely knew was coming. There is no record of his words, no testimony of his cries, only the heavy silence that has grown over centuries. And so, Edward II passed into legend, his death remembered not as a quiet passing, but as a story wrapped in fear, cruelty, and rumor. A story that, true or not, shaped how generations would think of him. The story of Edward II's death is one of the most notorious in medieval history, yet it is also one of the least certain. The lurid image of a red-hot poker, whispered by chroniclers, has captivated readers for centuries. But historians, looking closer, have long debated whether it was fact, fabrication, or something in between. The earliest accounts of Edward's death were vague. Some simply reported that he died in Berkeley Castle in September 1327, without detail. Others hinted at violence, but gave no specifics. It was only in later chronicles, written years after the event, that the tale of the poker emerged. These writers, often hostile to Edward or eager to moralize his downfall, may have embellished the story to make it memorable and to humiliate him further in death. Why such a grotesque method? The explanation may lie in the politics of the time. Edward II had long been mocked for his perceived weaknesses and for his close, sometimes scandalized relationships with male favorites. His enemies painted him as unmanly, indulgent, and unfit for kingship. The story of a sexualized, humiliating death may have been crafted to reinforce this reputation, tarnishing him forever. In the harsh logic of medieval propaganda, the poker was not just an instrument of death, it was a symbol, chosen to ridicule as much as to kill. Modern historians, therefore, approach the tale with skepticism. Some argue that Edward may have died of more ordinary causes: starvation, suffocation, or mistreatment by his captors. Others suggest he was indeed murdered, but by simpler means that left no outward mark. The poker story, they note, is simply too convenient as an insult, too perfectly designed to ridicule a fallen king. And yet, we cannot dismiss it entirely. Brutality was no stranger to the Middle Ages. Executions were often public, punishments designed to horrify. The fate of Hugh Despenser the Younger, Edward's ally, was grotesque beyond measure. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered, his body displayed as a warning. In such a world, the idea of a bizarre and cruel execution for a deposed king does not seem entirely beyond possibility. The debate is further complicated by rumors that Edward may not have died at all in 1327. Some later accounts claim he escaped captivity and lived in secret exile, wandering through Europe under assumed names. Though most historians dismiss these tales as wishful legends, their persistence shows how uncertain his fate appeared, even to those who lived not long after. What is clear is that the manner of Edward's death mattered less to his contemporaries than the lesson it carried. Whether he was killed brutally, quietly starved, or simply faded in despair, his end was seen as fitting for a king who had failed in his duties. Chroniclers shaped the story to serve their narratives, that God had judged him, that justice had been done, that kingship mishandled leads to ruin. For us, centuries later, the poker story is less a piece of evidence than a reflection of how history was written. It shows how rumor, symbolism, and propaganda can overshadow fact, turning a man's death into a legend that survives long after the truth has been lost. In the end, perhaps the real brutality lies not in the method, but in the memory. Edward's life was stripped of dignity, and his death, whatever its reality, was turned into a tale of ridicule. The man was gone, but the story, twisted and sensational, lived on. Imagine, for a moment, the silence of Berkeley Castle in the autumn of 1327. The stone walls are damp, heavy with the scent of earth and moss. The nights are long and chill, the kind that creep into the bones, no matter how tightly a blanket is drawn. Within those walls, in a chamber lit only by flickering torches, Edward II passed his last days. There is no grandeur here, no throne, no court, no procession of nobles to bow before him. Instead, there is the scrape of boots along the corridor outside his chamber, the murmur of guards exchanging words too low to hear. Sometimes, a key turns in the lock, the iron grinding against iron, and a servant enters, carrying bread, water, or thin broth. The food is set down without ceremony. The silence stretches on. For a king who had once held feasts, who had once commanded armies, who had once been surrounded by the sounds of music and pageantry, this quiet must have felt like a cruel inversion of all he had known. Power is loud. Captivity is hushed. In that stillness, Edward must have been left alone with thoughts of betrayal. His wife, Isabella, once queen beside him, had turned against him. His nobles, once his vassals, had abandoned him. The men who now held the keys to his chamber had once bent the knee in his presence. The air of the castle itself seemed to whisper of conspiracy. Chroniclers tell us that Edward feared constantly for his life, uncertain whether the next visit from his jailers would bring food or death. Each night, as torches guttered low, he may have listened to the faintest sounds, the clatter of chains, the rattle of wind against the shutters, the distant cries of animals, and wondered if they masked footsteps creeping closer. And then there were the rumors. Tales carried beyond the castle spoke of mistreatment, that he was denied warmth, that his captors mocked him with cruel tricks, that they sought to drive him to despair before delivering the final blow. Whether true or not, such stories show how closely humiliation clung to his fate. His enemies wanted not just his crown, but his dignity, stripped piece by piece until nothing remained but the shadow of a fallen king. In such an atmosphere, betrayal became more than an act. It became the air he breathed. The walls themselves, closing around him, seemed to hold secrets. Guards, monks, servants, all may have watched him with lowered eyes, unwilling or unable to offer kindness. And Edward, once a king, sat alone in his chamber, waiting for a fate he could not escape. When at last death came, whether by starvation, suffocation, or the cruel fire of rumor, it must have felt less like a sudden act and more like the final note of a long drawn-out silence. A silence of abandonment, of whispers behind doors, of betrayal so complete that even in his final breath, Edward had no friend beside him. The chroniclers wrote of his end with relish, their pens shaping his fall into legend. But if we step back, if we strip away the politics and the propaganda, what remains is a deeply human tragedy. A man once crowned, once celebrated, once feared, reduced to solitude, suspicion, and whispers in the night. And so, Edward II's story lingers not only in the brutality of his rumored execution, but in the atmosphere of his last days. The silence of stone walls, the flicker of torchlight, the knowledge that betrayal had brought him here. In that stillness, the brutal truth emerges, that kings may fall not only by sword or fire, but by the quiet suffocation of abandonment. Richard II was born into majesty. The grandson of Edward III, he inherited the throne of England as a boy of only 10 years old. His reign began under the watchful eyes of regents and powerful nobles. But as he grew into manhood, Richard sought to assert his authority, to carve out his own legacy as a monarch. He was a king of contrasts, capable of poetry and ceremony, yet also of sudden bursts of cruelty and vindictiveness. At times, his vision soared above his peers. He imagined a crown elevated beyond the reach of squabbling nobles, a monarchy adorned with pageantry and divine majesty. He surrounded himself with luxury, cultivated an air of sacred kingship, and ruled with an insistence on obedience that unsettled many of his subjects. To Richard, the throne was not a shared responsibility, but a solitary pinnacle, and he stood upon it with pride. But such pride came at a cost. His reliance on favorites angered the nobility. His heavy taxation burdened the commons, and his quarrels with Parliament bred resentment. His bold claims of absolute power clashed with the rising influence of England's magnates, men who believed the king should rule in cooperation with his lords. Tensions simmered, sometimes boiling into open conflict, as Richard clashed with those who challenged him. The end began with Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Hereford, a cousin of Richard and son of John of Gaunt. When Henry was exiled and disinherited by Richard, resentment turned to rebellion. In 1399, while Richard campaigned in Ireland, Henry returned to England with an army. Support for Richard evaporated with shocking speed. Nobles who had bowed before him now rallied to Henry, eager for change. The king, who had once envisioned himself as unassailable, found his throne crumbling beneath him. Richard returned from Ireland to find his kingdom slipping away. He attempted resistance, but his forces were too few, his allies too uncertain. Abandoned by many who had once sworn loyalty, he was captured and taken into custody. In a swift and almost bloodless coup, Henry Bolingbroke seized the crown, becoming Henry IV. For Richard, the humiliation was complete. Forced to abdicate, he signed away his kingship with trembling hand. Chroniclers described the scene as tragic. The once majestic king, who had spoken of divine right and sacred authority, now stripped of crown and dignity, reduced to a prisoner. His gilded halls and glittering ceremonies were replaced by the gray stone of confinement. At first, Richard was held under guard in the Tower of London, a place already steeped in the shadows of deposed rulers. Later, he was transferred to Pontefract Castle in Yorkshire, far from the heart of power. There, in the cold northern fortress, he entered the slow decline that would end in one of the most infamous deaths of medieval monarchy. He was no longer a king, but he was still a symbol, and symbols are dangerous. As long as Richard lived, some would whisper of restoration, of rebellion in his name. For Henry IV, the new ruler, Richard's presence was a threat that had to be managed. And so, in the silence of his prison, the former king awaited a fate that would come not with the swing of a sword, but with the slow cruelty of neglect. Thus began the final chapter of Richard II's life, a descent into hunger, isolation, and despair, where each day carried him further from majesty and closer to silence. In the cold walls of Pontefract Castle, Richard II was left to fade. His captors did not raise a sword against him, nor spill his blood in a public execution. Instead, they chose a slower, quieter cruelty, one that would erase him not with a single blow, but with the gradual theft of life itself. Starvation was among the most brutal forms of death in the Middle Ages. It was not sudden, not merciful. It dragged on for days, sometimes weeks, eroding the body piece by piece. The stomach cramped, the limbs weakened, the mind grew clouded, and hope withered as strength slipped away. For an ordinary prisoner, such an end was misery enough. For a former king, once surrounded by banquets and abundance, it was humiliation sharpened into torture. Chroniclers tell us that Richard's jailers reduced his rations until they ceased entirely. Bread and water, already meager, were withheld. The silence of hunger grew louder each day, gnawing at him from within. Some suggest he may have attempted to refuse food himself, despairing of his situation, though most agree the starvation was imposed upon him deliberately, a calculated method to end his life without the spectacle of execution. The cruelty of this method lay not only in the suffering, but in its concealment. A sword stroke or a hanging would have been swift and undeniable, but starvation could be disguised. If questioned, Richard's keepers might claim that he had simply wasted away, that illness or grief had carried him off. It was a way of killing without announcing murder, of erasing a king while keeping hands ostensibly clean. Day after day, Richard would have felt the strength ebbing from him. His once proud frame, dressed in royal robes and admired by courtiers, dwindled to frailty. His lips cracked, his eyes sank, his breath grew shallow. The man who had presided over courts and ceremonies, who had imagined himself as near divine, was left with nothing but the hollow ache of emptiness within. The stone chamber of Pontefract offered no relief. Winter in Yorkshire was harsh, and the cold seeped through the walls. Hunger and chill together must have weighed upon him like twin curses, each breath a struggle, each night an ordeal. The silence of the castle, broken only by the distant tread of guards or the rattle of keys pressed down heavily, as if even the air conspired against him. There was no dignity in such a death, no noble battle, no final speech to loyal subjects, no procession of priests with solemn prayers. Only the slow collapse of body and spirit, witnessed perhaps by indifferent jailers who brought nothing to ease his suffering. It was, in many ways, the most complete form of deposition, not only stripped of crown and throne, but of food, warmth, and life itself. By February of 1400, Richard was gone. The exact day is uncertain, the record shadowed by secrecy, but the cause most often given is starvation. His body was later displayed to prove his death, his thin frame shown to quell any whispers that he still lived. The new king, Henry IV, had secured his throne, not by open execution, but by the quiet, deliberate cruelty of hunger. And so ended Richard II, not with a clash of swords or the drama of rebellion, but with silence, emptiness, and the long, slow agony of starvation. To understand the final days of Richard II, it helps to imagine the world of medieval imprisonment. Castles were not only symbols of power, but also places of confinement, their thick walls serving both to protect and to restrain. For ordinary men, prison might mean a dungeon, dark and airless, where chains bit into skin and straw served as bedding. For a king, the chambers may have been less harsh in appearance, a room with a hearth perhaps, or a small window to admit light. Yet the true cruelty lay not in the stone itself, but in the isolation it imposed. Medieval prisons were seldom designed for reform or mercy. They were tools of control, instruments for breaking the spirit of those who opposed authority. Conditions varied, but neglect was common. Food was scarce, water brackish, and cold unrelenting. Disease bred in such places, carried by vermin, by damp, by unwashed bodies. The smell of rot and mold often clung to the air. Even when a captive was not actively tortured, the environment itself inflicted suffering. For political prisoners like Richard, cruelty often took subtler forms. It was not always the lash or the rack, but the slow erosion of hope. Solitary confinement cut men off from news of the world, leaving them uncertain whether friends still lived or enemies still hunted them. Guards could humiliate by denial of food, of warmth, of comfort. Every need became a weapon. A jug of water withheld, a blanket taken away, a meal delayed. Each deprivation reminded the prisoner that he was utterly powerless. Whispers, too, could be as cruel as chains. In castles like Pontefract, rumors circulated through servants and guards. A captive might overhear half-spoken words suggesting plots against him, or promises of execution soon to come. In the silence of isolation, such whispers could become torment, feeding fear until every sound seemed threatening. It is easy to picture Richard in such a place. Once a king of pageantry, of richly embroidered robes and glittering courts, now reduced to sitting on a wooden stool in a bare chamber, listening to the drip of water in a corner, shivering as wind slipped through cracks in the stone. His attendants, if any remained, were few and distant. The great hall where he had once dined was replaced by a cold cell, where hunger gnawed at his body. And yet, for all this suffering, outward appearances mattered. His keepers may have been instructed to avoid visible violence. A king killed by sword or axe would have been a martyr to some, a rallying cry for rebellion. But a king who wasted away in prison, who succumbed to the natural miseries of confinement, left less ground for protest. Starvation, isolation, and cruelty could be disguised as inevitability. This was the hidden weapon of medieval imprisonment. Its brutality was slow, almost invisible, yet no less lethal. The damp chill, the thin food, the endless silence, these were the instruments that broke men. They left no scars, but hollowed the body and spirit until nothing remained. For Richard, this slow erosion became his death sentence. His end was not a fiery spectacle, not a heroic clash, but the drawn-out collapse of a man once robed in majesty. In his prison cell, the grandeur of kingship was stripped bare, leaving only the fragile truth of flesh and hunger. Thus, the cruelty of his death was not simply in the starvation itself, but in the prison that made such a death possible. Walls that confined, silence that suffocated, and a system designed to reduce a king to nothing. Mary Stuart, better known as Mary, Queen of Scots, was born into a world of promise and peril. Crowned Queen of Scotland. When she was still a child, she grew up with the burdens of power resting heavily on her shoulders. Her life was marked by alliances, betrayals, and marriages that carried as much danger as hope. Yet it was her connection to England and her fateful rivalry with Elizabeth I that sealed her tragic destiny. Mary's claim to the English throne was her greatest asset and her greatest curse. As the great-granddaughter of Henry VII, she stood as a legitimate heir to the Tudor line. For Catholics across Europe, she represented an alternative to Elizabeth, whose Protestant rule divided the realm. To Elizabeth and her ministers, Mary was a threat, a living banner around which rebellion could gather. Her life in Scotland unraveled amid scandal and conflict. Marriages to Lord Darnley and later to the Earl of Bothwell brought turmoil. Darnley was murdered in 1567 under mysterious circumstances, and suspicion of Mary's involvement, whether true or not, stained her reputation. Her marriage to Bothwell, widely seen as coercive and reckless, further alienated her nobles. Within months, rebellion forced her to abdicate the Scottish throne in favor of her infant son, James VI. Fleeing her homeland, Mary sought refuge in England, trusting that Elizabeth, her cousin, would offer protection. But Elizabeth saw not a cousin in need, but a rival claimant whose presence threatened her crown. Instead of welcome, Mary received confinement. What began as protective custody stretched into nearly 2 decades of imprisonment, as Elizabeth and her council debated what to do with her. Mary's captivity was not that of a common prisoner. She was housed in castles and manor houses, with attendants and comforts. Yet every door was locked, every step watched. She wrote letters, plotted escape, and maintained contact with Catholic allies abroad, but her freedom was gone. Her very existence was a rallying point for conspiracies, most notably the Babington Plot of 1586, a scheme to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne. When Mary's coded letters were intercepted, the evidence sealed her fate. Elizabeth hesitated. To execute a fellow monarch was almost unthinkable. It set a dangerous precedent, but her advisors pressed the danger. As long as Mary lived, rebellion would fester. Reluctantly, Elizabeth signed the warrant for Mary's execution. For Mary, the sentence was both a release and a final humiliation. After 19 years of confinement, she would at last be free, but only through death. She prepared herself with dignity, requesting the sacraments of her faith, clothing herself in rich garments of red, the color of martyrdom. To her supporters, she was not a failed queen, but a martyr for Catholicism, a woman who would die for her faith and her claim. Thus, the long rivalry between Mary and Elizabeth, cousins bound by blood and divided by power, moved toward its grim conclusion. In the cold halls of Fotheringhay Castle, the stage was set for one of history's most infamous executions. On the morning of February 8th, 1587, the great hall of Fotheringhay Castle filled with solemnity and dread. Outside, the winter air was sharp and still, the sky overcast with gray. Inside, nobles, officials, and witnesses gathered to see the sentence carried out. A queen was about to die, not in battle, not by poison, but on the block, beneath the hand of an executioner. Mary entered the hall with calm dignity. She was dressed in black as if in mourning, but beneath the dark gown she wore a crimson petticoat, the color of martyrdom in the Catholic faith. The sight struck those present with awe, for she seemed to embrace her death not with fear, but with a kind of defiance. In her hands she carried a crucifix, her lips murmuring prayers as she walked. She mounted the wooden scaffold prepared for her, a platform draped in black cloth. Upon it rested the block, worn and stained by other executions, but now made infamous by hers. She looked out at the crowd, unflinching, and spoke words of forgiveness and faith. To Elizabeth, she offered no curse, only a final statement that she died steadfast in her Catholic belief, a martyr to her cause. The executioners approached, two men masked and somber. They knelt before her, asking forgiveness, as was the custom. Mary granted it, declaring she forgave all who had a hand in her death. Then she removed her black gown, revealing the scarlet beneath, a last act of symbolism that those present would never forget. She knelt at the block, resting her chin upon it, her hands folded in prayer. Silence filled the hall, heavy and thick, broken only by the sound of breath and the scrape of boots on wood. The executioner raised his axe high above his head, the steel catching the dim light. The first blow fell. It struck not cleanly, but awkwardly, gashing the back of her head and neck without severing it. A cry rose from the hall. Shock, horror, disbelief. The executioner lifted the axe again, his arms trembling, his aim faltering. The second stroke fell, cutting deeper, but still failing to sever the head completely. Only after a third blow was the grim task finished. Mary's head at last parted from her body. A silence fell, broken only by the executioner lifting the head to show the assembly. "God save the Queen," he declared, meaning Elizabeth, the rival who had condemned Mary to die. But as he held the head aloft, another grotesque surprise occurred. The auburn locks he grasped were not Mary's own hair, but a wig. Her head slipped from it and tumbled to the floor, revealing the short, graying hair beneath. Gasps echoed through the chamber. Even in death, indignity lingered. The botched execution became infamous. A queen, who had once ruled Scotland and claimed the right to rule England, had not died swiftly or cleanly. Her death required 3 strokes of the axe, her dignity shaken even as her courage shone. Those who witnessed it carried the memory for the rest of their lives, and chroniclers recorded it with a mixture of horror and fascination. It was not merely an execution, it was theater, a ritual of power and punishment. Every failed stroke, every gasp from the audience reinforced the brutal message that Elizabeth's crown was secure, that rivals could be broken, and that even a queen could be brought low upon the scaffold. Yet for Mary's supporters, the botched strokes only heightened her martyrdom. She had died not in silence but in blood, her final suffering making her a saintly figure in the eyes of many. What her enemies saw as humiliation, her allies saw as sanctification. In the brutality of the axe, Mary was transformed into legend. As the hall of Fotheringhay Castle settled into uneasy silence after Mary's beheading, the smell of blood and smoke of torches hung thick in the air. The executioners, weary from their grim task, prepared to strip the scaffold and remove the body. But then, in that dreadful stillness, came an unexpected and heartbreaking sight. From beneath Mary's gown, trembling and frightened, crept a small dog, her loyal little terrier, which had hidden there throughout the entire ordeal. Some say it had followed her secretly to the scaffold, slipping unnoticed beneath her skirts as she walked to her death. Others suggest that Mary herself had concealed it, seeking comfort in its presence as she faced her final moments. Whatever the truth, the image was unforgettable. The dog pressed itself against her lifeless body, whining softly, refusing to leave. It curled in the folds of her red petticoat, its fur stained with her blood, its small form shivering against the chill of the hall. No command, no hand could coax it away. Witnesses wrote of how it licked her face, unwilling to accept the silence, as if trying to wake its mistress from a cruel sleep. Those who had gathered to watch the execution, hardened though they were to the violence of their age, were moved by the sight. The cruelty of the axe, the faltering strokes, the shock of the severed head, all had been brutal, but this small animal's grief cut deeper, in a quieter, more devastating way. The dog's loyalty, so simple and unshaken, stood in stark contrast to the betrayals and politics that had brought Mary to her death. Chroniclers could not ignore the moment. In their accounts, the image of the dog became as enduring as the crimson petticoat or the botched execution. Where Elizabeth's council had hoped to stamp out Mary's memory with a decisive act of statecraft, the presence of that trembling creature ensured her death would be remembered not only for its brutality, but for its pathos. After the body was removed, the dog is said to have remained beside the bloodied garments, whining and refusing food. Some accounts claim it had to be carried away, so fierce was its attachment. In an age when executions were meant to strip away dignity, this small, faithful animal returned to Mary what politics had tried to erase, a humanity that transcended crowns and thrones. The image lingered because it spoke to something universal. People might argue over Mary's guilt or innocence, over her claims to the throne, over the plots and betrayals that entangled her. But no one could deny the sorrow of a small dog mourning its mistress. It was a moment of tenderness breaking through violence, a reminder that beneath the layers of power and history, Mary had been a woman, capable of being loved and mourned. In the centuries that followed, the tale of the dog was repeated again and again. Painters captured it in art, poets wove it into verse, and storytellers lingered on the haunting detail. The sight of that small, faithful creature ensured that Mary's execution would never be remembered as a mere act of political necessity. It became instead a legend of loyalty, loss, and sorrow. Thus, the little dog beneath the dress became part of Mary's final legacy, a symbol as enduring as her crimson petticoat. In its silent grief, it gave voice to all who pitied her fate, and it ensured that her death would echo not only in chronicles of statecraft, but in the hearts of all who hear her story. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, was not only the death of a woman, or even the silencing of a rival claimant to the throne. It was a spectacle so charged with symbolism that it became legend almost immediately. For those who witnessed it, the sight of a queen kneeling in crimson, dying under the clumsy strokes of an axe, lingered in memory. For those who heard of it afterward, the details, the failed blows, the wig, the faithful little dog, transformed her from a prisoner into a martyr, a figure larger than life. In Catholic Europe, Mary's death was received as the passing of a saintly queen. Her crimson underdress was interpreted as a deliberate sign of martyrdom, echoing the blood of Christ and the sacrifice of countless saints. Pamphlets, poems, and sermons spread across the continent, portraying her as a woman who had died for her faith against a heretical usurper. To Catholics, she was not a defeated queen, but a victorious martyr, whose death only strengthened their cause. In England, the government worked feverishly to shape the story differently. Elizabeth I, who had hesitated to sign the death warrant, reacted with a mixture of relief and horror. She sought to distance herself from the execution, claiming it had gone forward without her true consent. Her counselors, meanwhile, tried to present Mary's death as a necessity, a final safeguard against rebellion, a strike to secure the realm. Yet the brutality of the execution and the pity it evoked made this task difficult. The story spread rapidly, carried by travelers, chroniclers, and rumor. Each retelling shaped Mary anew. Some emphasized her courage, her final prayers, and her calm demeanor. Others lingered on the grotesque details, the multiple strokes of the axe, the wig that slipped away, the faithful dog at her side. Together, these elements gave the execution the quality of theater, a drama staged for history in which every detail carried weight. Over time, Mary's death became one of the defining legends of the 16th century. Painters captured her in luminous robes, serene upon the scaffold. Writers portrayed her as tragic and noble, undone not by her own failings, but by the cruelty of fate. Even her enemies could not entirely erase the pathos of her end, for the image of a queen brought low upon the block carried power beyond politics. For Elizabeth, Mary's death was both triumph and shadow. It secured her reign against immediate threat, but it stained her legacy with the blood of kin. The execution of a fellow monarch was nearly unthinkable. That it had been done to her cousin haunted her reputation. Some saw in it the mark of necessity, others the taint of cruelty. Either way, Elizabeth could never fully escape the shadow of that February morning. For us, centuries later, the story endures because it speaks to themes larger than crowns or claims. It is the story of rivalry, of betrayal, of faith tested by power. It is the story of dignity in the face of brutality, of humanity revealed in the loyalty of a small dog, of legend woven from blood and sorrow. Mary's death became legendary, not because she ruled wisely or lived without flaw. She did not. It became legendary because her end was so vivid, so charged with symbolism, that it transcended the politics of its time. She died not as a forgotten prisoner, but as a queen whose story continues to echo through the ages. The story of Henry VI's death cannot be understood without stepping into the turbulent world of the Wars of the Roses. This bitter civil conflict, fought between the houses of Lancaster and York, tore England apart during the 15th century. It was a war, not only of armies, but of dynasties, fought to decide who had the stronger claim to the throne. Henry VI, born in 1421, was a king of the Lancastrian line. He inherited the crown as a child, only 9 months old, after the death of his father, Henry V, the hero of Agincourt. But where Henry V had been strong and charismatic, Henry VI was gentle, pious, and fragile. He was a man more suited to prayer than to rule, more comfortable in quiet contemplation than in the hard demands of kingship. His reign was marked by misfortune. England's fortunes in France collapsed. The 100 Years' War ended in loss, and discontent festered at home. Worse still, Henry suffered from bouts of mental illness that left him incapable of governing for long stretches. During these times, the kingdom fell into the hands of powerful nobles, each vying for control in the name of the crown. It was in this climate of weakness that the House of York rose to challenge the House of Lancaster. Richard, Duke of York, and later his son Edward, claimed their blood gave them the stronger right to the throne. Battles erupted across the kingdom, fields and towns stained with the blood of Englishmen fighting their own kin. Henry, caught in the middle, was less a king than a pawn. His gentle nature and fragile mind made him ill-suited to command, and his powerful queen, Margaret of Anjou, often took the lead in defending the Lancastrian cause. Fierce and determined, Margaret fought to secure her husband's throne and the future of their son, Prince Edward. But the tide of war turned against them. In 1461, Edward of York defeated the Lancastrians and seized the throne as Edward IV. Henry was deposed, and for a time he lived as a fugitive, shuttled between hiding places while his enemies hunted him. The pious king, who preferred books and prayer, was reduced to a shadow of authority, dependent on loyalists who were themselves losing ground. Briefly, fortune seemed to smile upon him. In 1470, a rebellion against Edward IV restored Henry to the throne in what was called the Readeption. But this triumph was fleeting. By the following year, Edward had returned, victorious in battle once more. Henry was captured and confined in the Tower of London, while his son was killed at the Battle of Tewkesbury. With his heir dead and his queen in exile, Henry's position was hopeless. The Wars of the Roses had no room for rival claimants. As long as Henry lived, the Lancastrian cause, though beaten, could still stir rebellion. Edward IV, though triumphant, faced the constant risk that Henry might become a figurehead for discontent. To the Yorkist king and his council, the question was not if Henry should die, but when and how. Thus, by 1471, the stage was set for one of the most whispered murders in English history. A gentle king, unsuited to power, locked in the Tower of London, the very fortress meant to guard the crown, would soon meet his end, not in the clash of armies, but in silence, behind closed doors. The Tower of London has long been a place of paradox. Built to guard the realm and symbolize royal might, it was also the place where crowns were lost, where whispers of betrayal hung in the air, and where kings themselves sometimes became captives. For Henry VI, the Tower was both prison and prelude to death. When he was first confined, after Edward IV's return to power in 1471, Henry was no longer the monarch he had once been. Chroniclers describe him as weary and broken, a man of frail body and troubled mind. He had known defeat, flight, and capture before, but now there was no more hope. His only son, Prince Edward of Westminster, had fallen at Tewkesbury, cut down in the fury of battle. His queen, Margaret of Anjou, fierce protector of his cause, had been taken prisoner. With no heir and no allies, Henry's claim to kingship was little more than a memory. The tower that received him was no ordinary jail. Its thick stone walls had held many prisoners of rank, and its chambers varied from bleak cells to more comfortable lodgings. Henry's quarters were likely modest, but not cruel. A chamber befitting his status, yet bound by locks and guards. Windows may have admitted dim light across stone walls, but freedom was gone. Each door was heavy, each corridor patrolled, every sound echoing the fact that he was a king in name only. What must it have been to sit within those walls, knowing that the crown had slipped away? Henry was a man inclined toward piety, gentle in spirit, and his thoughts may have turned often to prayer. Chroniclers hint that he endured his captivity with quiet resignation, murmuring psalms, seeking solace in Scripture. He had never been a warrior king. His reign was defined by indecision and passivity. Now, in his cell, he may have found a strange peace and surrender. Yet around him, the tower breathed with unease. Guards and warders moved in silence, aware that the man they kept was both helpless and dangerous. Helpless, because he had no strength to command. Dangerous, because his mere presence could ignite rebellion. So long as Henry lived, the Lancastrian cause retained a shadow of legitimacy. And so, though the chambers held stillness, they also held tension, the unspoken knowledge that his days were numbered. The tower itself seemed designed to weigh upon prisoners' minds. Its stones held centuries of stories, some of them whispered, some of them blood-soaked. The ravens wheeled above, the Thames lapped at its base, and within its walls lingered the ghosts of those who had passed before. For Henry, whose mind was often troubled, the tower must have been both sanctuary and torment, a cloister for prayer, but also a cage where each prayer might be his last. Visitors were few, if any. His queen was far away, his son lost, his friends defeated. The solitude of imprisonment was complete. The king, who had once sat upon a throne, robed and crowned, now sat on a wooden stool within a locked chamber, guarded more carefully than a common criminal. And outside, beyond the tower's walls, the Yorkist regime tightened its grip. Edward IV rode in triumph, his crown secure, his enemies destroyed. For him, Henry's existence was a shadow across his reign, a reminder that the Wars of the Roses were not fully ended. So long as Henry breathed, there remained the possibility of plots and uprisings. Thus, while Henry prayed in silence within the tower, his fate was already decided. The prison was not meant to hold him for long. It was meant to contain him until the moment came for silence to be made permanent. On the night of May 21st, 1471, the stillness of the Tower of London was broken by a deed cloaked in secrecy. Henry VI, the last king of the Lancastrian line, was found dead in his chamber. No public announcement of execution had been made. No formal trial declared him guilty. He simply ceased to live. And in that silence, whispers of murder began to spread. The official story was simple. Henry had died of grief and sorrow, worn down by captivity and the loss of his son. Chroniclers loyal to Edward IV recorded that the deposed king had passed away naturally, broken-hearted, in the solitude of the tower. Yet few believed it. Henry was only 50 years old, and though frail in body and mind, he was not known to be gravely ill. To many, the timing of his death was too convenient, too sudden to be chance. Rumors spread quickly. Some said he was stabbed as he knelt in prayer. Others claimed he was suffocated, smothered quietly by men sent to finish the work of war. The details varied, but the truth was plain enough. Henry had been murdered. His death was not an accident of nature, but an act of politics. The hand most often suspected was that of Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the man who would later become Richard III. As Edward IV's loyal brother, Richard was said to have carried out the killing on his behalf, ensuring the last Lancastrian claimant would trouble them no more. Whether Richard struck the blow himself or merely oversaw it remains uncertain, but in the minds of many, his shadow loomed over that night. The method, too, remains shrouded. Chroniclers writing years later debated whether Henry had been stabbed through the chest or suffocated with a pillow. Suffocation, after all, left no wound, no visible proof of murder. It was the method of choice when discretion was desired. When one wished to claim a prisoner had died naturally, stabbing, on the other hand, left no doubt, but perhaps served as a final act of cruelty against a helpless king. What is clear is that his death was deliberate. Edward IV had secured his throne after years of struggle. With Henry alive, rebellion might still find a banner in the old king's name. With Henry dead, the Lancastrian cause was buried with him. The Wars of the Roses were not yet over, but the balance had shifted. Edward could now rule without the constant specter of his rival. Imagine the scene within the tower that night. The chamber dimly lit by a torch. The king seated in prayer, or lying on his narrow bed, the door opening to admit men whose faces carried no pity. A hand upon his shoulder, a weapon drawn, or a cloth pressed swiftly across his mouth. The struggle, if there was one, left no echo in history. Only the silence afterward, when the deed was done, when a king's body lay lifeless in the stillness of stone walls. The next morning, his death was announced. His body was carried to Chertsey Abbey, buried without pomp, without ceremony. No grand funeral, no procession of mourners, only a quiet interment, as though to erase him from memory as swiftly as possible. Later, his remains would be moved to Windsor, but by then, the secrecy of his end had already woven itself into legend. Thus, Henry VI, gentle and pious, met his end not on a battlefield, but in the shadows of a prison. Murdered in silence, remembered in whispers, his death was the quiet stroke that secured a throne. The death of Henry VI was not merely the end of a frail, pious man. It was a political calculation, one shaped by the dangerous weight of killing kings. In medieval England, royal blood carried a sanctity that could not easily be brushed aside. To strike down a crowned ruler was to commit a crime against the order of the realm, one that might spark rebellion, outrage, or even divine condemnation. And yet, when kings became inconvenient, when their very existence threatened the throne, such deaths became grim necessities. The Wars of the Roses had already taught England how fragile monarchy could be. Kings were made and unmade not only by battles, but by whispers, betrayals, and the shifting loyalties of powerful nobles. Henry VI, though weak in mind and body, remained a symbol. To his supporters, he was the rightful king, God's chosen. still bearing the anointing oil upon his brow. So long as he lived, rebellion could rise in his name. But to kill him openly would have been dangerous. A public execution might make him a martyr, a figure around whom the faithful could rally. His death on the block would have declared to the world that Edward IV had destroyed his rival by force, and in an age of divine kingship, such an act might have been read as rebellion against God himself. Kings were meant to be sacred, untouchable, even when they were defeated. Thus, secrecy became the weapon of choice. By killing Henry quietly, in the stillness of his chamber, Edward's regime could shape the story. The announcement of natural causes, or death by grief, allowed them to claim innocence, to present the passing as inevitable rather than deliberate. The suffocating cloth, the hidden blade, these methods left no spectacle, no rallying point, only silence. And silence was safer than spectacle. With Henry gone, Edward IV could move forward with his reign, unburdened by a living rival. The Lancastrian line had been cut short, the prince slain at Tewkesbury, the father suffocated in the Tower. The red rose had withered in shadow, while the white rose of York flourished in sunlight. For Edward, the murder of Henry was not a matter of cruelty, but of survival. This was the brutal logic of medieval politics. The throne was not a seat of peace, but a prize of war. Those who won it had to guard it jealously, for rivals lurked in every corner. To spare an enemy was to invite danger. To kill him openly was to risk rebellion. To kill him quietly was to remove the threat and leave behind only whispers. For those who lived through it, the truth of Henry's end mattered less than its effect. His supporters were left leaderless, their cause broken. His enemies ruled without the burden of his shadow. Yet the whispers never vanished. Chroniclers continued to hint at murder, to record suspicions of suffocation or stabbing. And in those whispers lay the uncomfortable truth that even kings, anointed and crowned, could be struck down when power demanded it. For us, centuries later, the murder of Henry VI stands as a reminder of the fragility of medieval kingship. It shows how the crown was both armor and target, how a man could be raised high by divine right, yet destroyed in silence by human ambition. His death was not the drama of a battlefield, nor the spectacle of a scaffold. It was quieter, subtler, and in some ways more chilling. A king erased in the night, his crown slipping into the hands of his rival, his memory left to linger in the shadows of the Tower. Charles VI of France, remembered by history as Charles the Mad, is one of the most tragic figures of medieval monarchy. Born in 1368, he ascended the throne as a boy of only 11, inheriting a kingdom weary from the ravages of the 100 Years' War. At first, the young king showed promise. Courtiers and chroniclers described him as bright, handsome, and energetic. In his youth, he led campaigns with vigor, inspired loyalty, and seemed destined to restore France's shaken fortunes. But the promise of his early reign soon gave way to a darkness that neither crown nor council could contain. Beginning in his early 20s, Charles began to suffer terrifying episodes of mental instability. The first occurred in 1392 during a campaign in Brittany. Without warning, he drew his sword and attacked his own men, killing some and wounding others before being restrained. From that moment forward, the shadow of madness clung to him. The episodes recurred with dreadful regularity. Sometimes he would fail to recognize his wife, Queen Isabeau, or his children, staring at them as though they were strangers. At other times, he fell into catatonic silence, unresponsive to words or touch, retreating into a private world where no one could follow. Chroniclers describe him as running wildly through his chambers, howling like an animal, or shattering furniture in manic fury. One of the most infamous delusions was his belief that he was made of glass. He insisted that he would shatter if touched too firmly, and so he ordered iron rods sewn into his clothing to protect his fragile body. Servants had to approach with care, speaking softly, moving slowly, lest the king break beneath their hands. This image, a king armored not against swords, but against the imagined danger of his own fragility, became a lasting symbol of his reign. The instability left him vulnerable to manipulation. During his lucid periods, he could be gentle, even devout, but in his madness, the governance of France slipped into the hands of ambitious nobles. His queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, took a leading role in politics, but she was distrusted by many and accused of corruption and betrayal. Rival factions, including the powerful dukes of Burgundy and Orleans, seized upon the king's weakness to pursue their own interests. Civil war erupted between Armagnac and Burgundian factions, dividing France from within, even as the English pressed from without. To the people of France, Charles became a tragic figure, a king who bore the crown but could not wield its power, a monarch trapped in his own fractured mind while his kingdom fractured around him. His instability was not a private burden, but a public disaster, for the fate of France was tied to the state of its king. And as the king faltered, so too did the realm. The cruelty of Charles's condition was not only in his suffering, but in the way it was used against him. Factions blamed one another for his madness, claiming sorcery, poison, or divine punishment. In truth, his illness was likely some form of hereditary mental disorder, perhaps schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. But in the medieval mind, it was proof of sin, curse, or curse-born weakness. His very mind became a battlefield, and in it, France itself seemed to lose its way. Thus, Charles VI's reign was remembered not for victories, but for visions, not for justice, but for delusion. His madness was no passing affliction, but a constant companion, shaping his legacy and leaving the kingdom adrift. And so, long before his death, Charles was already seen as a broken king, a man whose mind betrayed him, whose crown weighed too heavily upon fragile shoulders, and whose suffering mirrored the suffering of France itself. By the early 15th century, Charles VI's reign had become a shadow of its former promise. His long struggle with mental illness had left the kingdom fragmented, and his own body and spirit worn down by years of torment. The king who had once ridden proudly into battle now lived as a hollow presence, trapped between moments of lucidity and long stretches of confusion. His final years were marked by a cruel rhythm, days of relative clarity, when he could converse calmly or take solace in prayer, followed by sudden descents into delusion. Chroniclers describe how, in his episodes, he sometimes failed to recognize even himself. He wandered through his palaces unwashed, refusing to change his clothing for months. His hair grew matted, his body frail, as courtiers whispered of the spectacle of their unkempt king. The neglect was not merely physical, but political. As his condition worsened, the governance of France slipped ever more fully into the hands of others. Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, already mistrusted, became the de facto ruler, her reputation tainted by accusations of corruption and alliances with the enemy. The great nobles pursued their own interests, and rival factions deepened the kingdom's fractures. To many, it seemed as though the king's madness had infected the whole realm. Charles himself became increasingly isolated. Servants attended to him, but their care could not soften the sense of abandonment. He was avoided at court, his presence an uncomfortable reminder of weakness. The great ceremonies of monarchy, once meant to display power and majesty, withered into silence. The king remained physically alive, but symbolically absent, a hollow throne at the heart of France. Meanwhile, the kingdom suffered. The 100 Years' War entered one of its darkest chapters, with the English gaining ground and internal civil wars weakening resistance. In 1415, the disastrous defeat at Agincourt underscored France's fragility. By 1420, under the Treaty of Troyes, Charles was compelled to recognize Henry V of England as his heir, disinheriting his own son, the Dauphin Charles. It was a humiliation of staggering proportions. A king so diminished in body and mind that he surrendered his dynasty's future to a foreign crown. For Charles VI, the final years were marked by an almost symbolic decay. His body weakened with illness, his mind clouded with delusions, his authority stripped by foreign treaties and domestic betrayal. He was surrounded by distrust, by the whispers of courtiers who saw in him only the reflection of their nation's suffering. His madness, once shocking, had become a weary routine, a symbol of a France adrift, weakened and humiliated. Accounts of his later life paint a picture of a man abandoned to misery. He was left in rooms where neglect wore at him as surely as illness. His meals were plain, his care minimal, as though the kingdom itself had grown tired of him. The crown sat upon his head in name, but in truth he was already buried in the silence of his own mind. When death at last came in 1422, it was almost a relief. He had suffered for decades, a prisoner not of stone walls, but of his own failing mind, a man who had lived too long with humiliation and decline. He died not in the grandeur of battle or the dignity of ceremony, but in frailty, in illness, in neglect. His body, wasted by years of struggle, carried him quietly out of the world. And yet, in that final passing, the symbolism was heavy. The king's suffering had mirrored that of his kingdom. As he decayed, so had France. As his mind faltered, so had its unity. His death was not only the end of a life, but the closing of a long chapter of national despair. By the year 1422, Charles VI had endured nearly 4 decades of rule overshadowed by illness. His body was weakened, his mind eroded by years of torment, and his kingdom fractured beyond repair. What remained of his reign was no longer marked by ceremony or majesty, but by the slow brutality of neglect. In those final months, the king lived more as a relic than a ruler. His court, weary of his madness, had long since turned its focus elsewhere, to Queen Isabeau's intrigues, to the rivalries of the nobles, to the looming English threat. Charles himself was left in the margins of his own monarchy. Chroniclers describe him as thin, pale, and frail, his once vigorous frame wasted by illness. His clothing was often unchanged, his appearance unkempt. In the candlelight of his chambers, he looked less like a king than a forgotten patient. Paranoia marked his last days as surely as sickness. The king's delusions often returned, leaving him fearful of those around him. He sometimes refused food or drink, suspecting poison, and recoiled from attendants as though they were threats. At other times, he sank into silence, staring vacantly into space, unreachable even to those who spoke his name. For a king whose authority had once been sacred, the sight was both pitiful and deeply symbolic. France itself seemed poisoned, suspicious, and broken. Illness carried him further into decline, though medicine in the 15th century offered little more than herbs, bleeding, and prayers. Even these treatments were inconsistent. A king of sound body might have commanded careful attention, but Charles, by now, was more burdened than sovereign. The neglect he endured was a quiet brutality, one that sapped strength more cruelly than any sword. To fade without care, to be left in filth and confusion, was to suffer an indignity that history has not forgotten. Outside his chambers, France was disintegrating. The Treaty of Troyes had declared Henry V of England heir to the French throne, disinheriting Charles's own son, the Dauphin. But Henry himself had died in 1422, leaving his infant son, Henry VI, as claimant to both crowns. Thus, even as Charles lay dying, France stood divided between an English king still in swaddling clothes and a Dauphin desperate to rally support. The king's illness mirrored the illness of the state. Both were fractured, weak, and vulnerable. On October 21st, 1422, Charles VI died in Paris. The exact cause was illness, likely compounded by malnutrition, neglect, and the long decay of his mind and body. He was 53 years old, not old by the standards of kingship, but aged beyond his years by decades of suffering. Chroniclers recorded his death with little grandeur. There was no noble last speech, no dramatic flourish, only the quiet passing of a king whose reign had long since slipped away. And yet, though his death was not violent in the conventional sense, it carried its own form of brutality. To watch a king waste away in paranoia, to let his body fail without dignity, was to destroy him as surely as a blade. His neglect was deliberate, a reflection of how his court and his kingdom had ceased to see him as sovereign. He was a man abandoned, and in his abandonment lay the cruelty of his end. His funeral, too, reflected this decline. Though buried in the Basilica of Saint-Denis, among France's great monarchs, the ceremony was subdued, the mood weary. Few mourned deeply, for most had long since grown accustomed to his absence from rule. His death felt less like a rupture than the slow closing of a book long left unattended. And so, Charles VI's end was remembered not for the spectacle of battle or execution, but for the haunting image of a king wasted by illness and neglect. His life and death stood as mirror and metaphor. As his mind and body failed, so too did France, left fractured, humiliated, and waiting for salvation that seemed far away. The death of Charles VI was not only the end of a man, but the embodiment of a kingdom's despair. His reign, long overshadowed by madness and decline, came to symbolize the unraveling of France itself. To his contemporaries, it seemed that, as the king faltered, so too did the realm, as though the crown and the country were bound together in suffering. In the medieval mind, the king was more than a ruler. He was the living heart of the kingdom. His health was thought to reflect the health of the land, his stability the foundation of order. A strong king brought peace and prosperity. A weak king invited chaos and famine. In Charles VI, this belief found grim confirmation. His mind fractured, his body decayed, and France endured the same. Divided by civil war, humiliated by foreign invasion, drained by endless conflict. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. When Charles wandered his palace believing he was made of glass, France itself seemed brittle, one blow away from shattering. When he failed to recognize his own family, France was equally lost, forgetting its unity, forgetting its identity. And when neglect consumed him in his final years, the kingdom too was left abandoned, treated like a pawn by foreign powers, and betrayed by its own nobility. The Treaty of Troy was the most bitter reflection of this decline. It was signed in Charles's name, though he could scarcely comprehend its meaning. By it, he disinherited his own son, the Dauphin Charles, and acknowledged the English king as heir to France. To his supporters, this was proof not of political calculation, but of a broken king manipulated by those around him. His weakness became the nation's humiliation, and his decline its living metaphor. Even his death carried symbolic weight. When Charles died in 1422, he left a kingdom torn in two, one half pledging allegiance to an infant English king, the other rallying to disinherited Dauphin, the future Charles VII. The king's passing did not heal France. It deepened its fracture, mirroring the fracture of his own mind. Chroniclers of the time, and those who wrote later, dwelt heavily on this symbolism. They described his reign as cursed, his madness as a punishment, his suffering as the visible mark of a kingdom under divine judgment. Some saw in his death the hope of renewal, that with the broken king gone, France might be restored. Others saw only tragedy, the end of a reign that had dragged France into misery and shame. And yet, there was also pity. For all his weakness, Charles VI was not cruel or bloodthirsty. He was not a tyrant who reveled in destruction, but a man undone by forces beyond his control, by illness, by the ambitions of others, by the relentless tide of history. His madness was his tragedy, but also France's. In him, people saw not only a failed king, but the fragility of kingship itself, the vulnerability of human flesh beneath the weight of a crown. His death, quiet and neglected, became a kind of closing act for a long play of suffering. It left France to seek new strength in his son, Charles VII, who in time would rally the kingdom with the help of figures like Joan of Arc. But for those who lived through Charles VI's reign, the memory of the mad king lingered as a symbol of fragility and ruin, a reminder of how the fall of one man could echo across an entire realm. Thus, Charles VI's end was remembered not only as the death of a king, but as the image of a kingdom breaking with him. His glass delusions, his paranoia, his frailty, all became metaphors for a France on the edge of collapse. In his suffering, France saw its own reflection, and when he died, the silence of his chambers seemed to echo the silence of a nation exhausted by war, waiting desperately for salvation. On August 22nd, 1485, the fields near Market Bosworth in Leicestershire became the stage for one of the most decisive battles in English history. There, Richard III, the last king of the House of Plantagenet, met his death in combat, and with him ended an entire dynasty. His fall was not a quiet whisper in a prison chamber, but a brutal spectacle in the mud and chaos of war. Richard III's reign had been short and troubled. Crowned in 1483, after the suspicious disappearance of his young nephews, the princes in the Tower, he was widely viewed with suspicion. Whispers of murder clung to him, whether true or not, and his legitimacy was questioned by rivals who claimed stronger ties to the throne. Chief among them was Henry Tudor, a claimant exiled in France, who now returned with an army to stake his claim. At Bosworth, Richard faced Henry's smaller but determined force. The battle unfolded in confusion, the air thick with dust, cries, and the clash of steel. Richard, unlike some monarchs who commanded from afar, plunged directly into the fighting. Chroniclers tell us he led a desperate cavalry charge aimed at Henry himself, hoping to end the battle with a single blow by killing his rival on the field. For a moment, it seemed he might succeed. He cut down Henry's standard-bearer, scattering those around him. But the charge carried him too far, and he became surrounded. There, amid the swirl of soldiers, Richard fought for his life. Accounts describe his helmet torn away, his face exposed, his body pressed on all sides. Medieval combat was savage and intimate, swords hacking through limbs, pole arms crushing helmets, arrows cutting through flesh. Richard, though a king, was no less vulnerable than the men around him. Modern analysis of his skeletal remains, discovered in 2012 beneath a Leicester car park, confirmed the brutality of his death. His skull bore multiple wounds, a massive blow from a halberd that sliced deep into the bone, likely fatal, a sword strike to the back of the head, punctures consistent with daggers thrust downward after he had fallen. His body bore further injuries, ribs, pelvis, and arms struck as though by men eager to ensure his death. This was not a clean or ceremonial killing. It was a frenzy. A king hacked down in the mud like any common soldier. His body was stripped, slung naked across a horse, and paraded back to Leicester. The image was meant to humiliate. The king who had once worn the crown displayed like carrion, his broken body a warning to others. He was buried hastily in a friary church, without ceremony, his grave shallow and forgotten. Only centuries later would his bones be rediscovered and given the dignity of royal burial. Richard's fall at Bosworth was more than a personal tragedy. It ended the Plantagenet dynasty that had ruled England for over 3 centuries, ushering in the Tudor age under Henry VII. Yet the brutality of his death remains striking. For all the trappings of royalty, for all the crowns and ceremonies, Richard III died as many men did on medieval battlefields, surrounded, outnumbered, struck down by iron and steel, his body mutilated by blows that left no doubt of his defeat. The chaos of Bosworth reminds us that the battlefield was a place where kings could not hide behind walls or courtiers. In the frenzy of combat, armor could fail, numbers could overwhelm, and a crown offered no shield. Richard's death, preserved in both chroniclers' words and in the scars upon his bones, stands as one of the clearest examples of the dangers faced by royals who led their men into battle. The Crusades were the great holy wars of the Middle Ages, where kings, princes, and nobles left their homelands to fight for faith and glory in distant lands. Yet for all the grandeur of their vows and the pomp of their departures, many met their ends far from home, in heat, disease, or battlefields as brutal as any in Europe. One of the most famous was Richard I of England, remembered as Richard the Lionheart. Though he survived the Third Crusade and returned to Europe, his death was not the glorious end of a Crusader king, but a brutal reminder of vulnerability. In 1299, while besieging a castle in Limousin, he was struck by a crossbow bolt. The wound festered with infection, common in an age before antiseptics, and within days the great warrior king was dead. His passing showed how even a monarch famed for his strength and valor could be undone by a single missile from the walls of a minor fortress. Other Crusader kings fared no better. Louis IX of France, revered as Saint Louis, led 2 crusades in the 13th century. On the first, he was captured by Muslim forces in Egypt, humiliated, and forced to pay a massive ransom. Undeterred, he launched another expedition years later, only to die in 1270, not by sword, but by plague, succumbing in the sweltering heat of North Africa. His body, racked by illness, was far from the sanctity of Paris, where he would later be canonized. Even emperors faced brutal fates on crusade. Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, drowned in 1290 while attempting to cross a river in Asia Minor on the way to the Holy Land. Chroniclers describe him as swept away by the current, his armor dragging him under. His army, disheartened, faltered without him, and his body, lost to the waters, became a symbol of how swiftly the hopes of a crusade could drown alongside its leader. For these kings, death abroad carried its own harshness. To die in battle or illness was one wound, but to die far from one's homeland added another. Their bodies had to be transported across seas or buried in foreign soil. Their courts grieved from a distance, while their enemies often rejoiced in their demise. The Crusader battlefield was particularly perilous for royals. Unlike in their own realms, where a captured king might be ransomed, in the Holy Land, death was often swift and merciless. Disease stalked the camps, heat exhausted the men, and the long marches drained even the strongest. Armor, designed for the damp chill of Europe, became suffocating in desert sun. Horses collapsed, men fainted, and kings, no matter their exalted rank, were subject to the same relentless forces. For their followers, the deaths of these kings were shattering. A king was not only a commander, but a symbol, a banner under which thousands rallied. When the king fell, morale crumbled. Crusading armies, already fragile, often dissolved into chaos when deprived of royal leadership. Yet the deaths also became legend. Chroniclers painted them as martyrs of the cross, men who died for Christendom, their blood mingling with the dust of holy lands. Richard's wound, Louis's plague, Frederick's drowning. Each became not just a tragedy, but a tale retold in churches and courts, a reminder that the dangers of battle spared no one, not even the crowned. In truth, their deaths were less glorious than their legends suggest. They were sudden, humiliating, painful, and in many cases, preventable. Infection, disease, drowning. These were the enemies as deadly as any sword. And in the harsh logic of the Middle Ages, they served as reminders that kingship was no armor against fate. To imagine the death of kings in battle, we must first step into the battlefield itself, a place of dust, blood, confusion, and noise so overwhelming that even royalty could be reduced to mere flesh in an instant. Unlike the orderly lines of a chessboard, medieval battles rarely followed clean patterns. They were swirling storms of men, horses, weapons, and screams. In such chaos, crowns offered little protection. At dawn, armies gathered in formation, banners fluttering, horns sounding across the fields. Kings rode at the head, armored in gleaming steel, their surcoats embroidered with lions, lilies, or crosses. To their soldiers, they were symbols of divine favor, rallying points that inspired courage. But once the clash began, order quickly dissolved. Arrows darkened the sky, horses screamed, and the pounding of hooves shook the earth. The air filled with dust, choking vision, and the cries of the dying drowned out the shouts of commanders. In this maelstrom, even kings struggled to command. Armor was strong, but not invincible. A well-placed arrow could pierce through a visor. A halberd or poleaxe, swung with force, could crack helmets and shatter bones. Lances splintered, swords hacked, and maces crushed, each blow indifferent to whether it struck noble or commoner. The chaos did not discriminate. Royalty were especially vulnerable because they were visible. Their banners marked their presence. Their armor, though fine, often stood out with decoration. Enemies sought them deliberately, knowing that to bring down a king could decide a battle in an instant. At Bosworth, Richard III's final charge toward Henry Tudor exposed him fatally. At Crécy and Agincourt, English arrows sought out French nobles with ruthless efficiency, scattering their lines. Even when kings were surrounded by bodyguards, the press of battle could overwhelm them. Horses stumbled in mud, throwing riders into the crush. A fallen king, pinned beneath bodies, was easy prey for daggers thrust through armor gaps. Chroniclers described the battlefield as littered with trampled men, suffocated beneath heaps of bodies. In such a place, no title or crown mattered. Survival came down to chance and the swing of another man's arm. The wounds themselves were gruesome. A sword could sever fingers or cleave through a faceplate. A mace might cave in a skull with a single blow. Polearms could slice through limbs or pierce through chainmail. Infection followed even survivable wounds, meaning that death often came days later in agony. For kings, who might once have dined in gilded halls, the end on a battlefield was often bloody, muddy, and utterly devoid of dignity. The noise, too, was a weapon. Men screamed in rage, in pain, in fear. Trumpets and drums added to the clamor. The clash of steel on steel rang in the air. Amid this, commands were lost, orders unheard. Even the most disciplined army dissolved into smaller knots of men fighting desperately for their lives. A king, caught in such chaos, was no different than his soldiers, blinded by dust, deafened by screams, and struck from every side. And when death came, it was often swift and merciless. Chroniclers note that enemies rarely hesitated once a king was cornered. The prestige of striking down a monarch was immense, and in the frenzy of battle, hesitation could mean one's own death. Thus, blows rained down until the royal body no longer moved, leaving the battlefield to decide a dynasty with blood instead of parchment. It was in these brutal realities that kings met their end, not in grand duels of honor, but in the mud, the crush, and the chaos. Their deaths remind us that the medieval battlefield was the great equalizer. Whether knight or king, noble or commoner, the weapons did not care. In the storm of combat, crowns shattered as easily as bones. The Crusades were imagined as holy endeavors, gilded with promises of divine glory and eternal reward. Kings and princes marched across continents, leaving their thrones behind in pursuit of Jerusalem, the navel of the world. Songs and poems heralded them as champions of Christendom, warriors anointed not only with oil, but with the very mission of God. Yet for many, the path to the Holy Land led not to triumph, but to humiliation and death in the dust, the heat, and the pestilence of foreign lands. Unlike the grandeur of battles sung by minstrels, The reality of crusading was harsh, and it often claimed kings not with sword strokes, but with the creeping misery of disease. The blazing sun of the Levant was unlike the temperate skies of Europe. Marches stretched for days across arid lands. Food rotted, and water supplies grew tainted. Armies weakened long before reaching the walls of any fortress. And so, kings who had left their homelands clad in armor and draped in banners sometimes ended their journeys sweating and delirious, brought low by fevers they could not fight. Louis IX of France, Saint Louis, is perhaps the most famous example. Revered as a pious monarch, he led 2 crusades, each ending in tragedy. On his first, in Egypt in 1249, disease ravaged his army. Dysentery and fever swept through the camp like wildfire. Louis himself was captured, weakened and humiliated, and forced to pay ransom before being released. Still, he returned years later for another attempt. In 1270, leading an expedition in North Africa, he again found his army crippled, not by swords, but by sickness. Dysentery struck him too, and the king who had hoped to carry the cross into glory died instead on foreign soil, wasting away in the heat. Chroniclers describe him lying beneath a crude tent, whispering prayers as his body failed him. His death, a stark contrast to the triumphs he had imagined. The grim litany continued with other crusading leaders. Richard the Lionheart, though famed for his valor and survival during the Third Crusade, eventually succumbed not in Jerusalem, but years later to infection from a crossbow wound. A reminder that even minor injuries could be fatal when sepsis set in. Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, the leper king, fought with brilliance and courage, yet his body slowly decayed from disease until death took him in his 20s, his suffering visible to all. The common thread was humiliation. To die in combat was one thing. To die in one's tent, weakened by foul water or a festering stomach, was another. Dysentery, a relentless affliction of diarrhea, fever, and dehydration, stripped men of dignity, and kings were not spared. Chroniclers wrote of rulers writhing on crude pallets, their flesh covered in sweat, their bodies wasting as they struggled for breath. These deaths were slow and degrading, cruel in ways a sword strike could never be. For their followers, such deaths were devastating. A king represented divine favor, the very promise that God was with them. To see him reduced to a shivering, broken body, to see him buried hastily in foreign soil, or carted back in pieces for interment, was to feel abandoned. Armies crumbled when their leaders fell to disease, morale draining as swiftly as life left the royal body. These were the exotic and mysterious deaths of crusade, not dramatic clashes with Saracen armies, but fevers, poisoned water, and filth. They remind us that medieval kings were still men, and their bodies as vulnerable as any foot soldiers. The crown offered no protection against bacteria, against heat, against the unseen enemies that haunted camps and rivers. And so, kings who had set out to conquer the holy city often found themselves conquered instead by the slow cruelty of illness, far from home, their banners drooping, their bodies undone by forces beyond their control. For medieval kings, war was supposed to be the stage where honor was won and memory secured. Chroniclers and poets alike promised that crusading monarchs would return crowned with glory, their names etched into both history and heaven. Yet the reality was often more bitter. Sickness, weakness, and the long indignities of illness. For rulers raised to believe themselves chosen by God, there was no end more humiliating. Consider again Louis IX of France. His reputation as the most devout of kings carried him to North Africa in 1270, where he dreamed of expanding Christendom and winning the Holy Land by proxy. Instead, dysentery swept through his camp. Louis himself fell ill, reduced to lying on a bed of rough cloth, his body racked with fever. Accounts describe him refusing fine foods and comforts, subsisting on water and bread in imitation of Christ. Yet no prayer, no austerity could save him. The most Christian king died not in the thunder of battle, but in filth and fever. His body weakened until it could no longer resist. To his soldiers, it was a stunning humiliation. The saintly monarch ending not with triumph, but with groans of pain beneath a tent. Richard the Lionheart's end carried the same sting of irony. Famed across Europe as the very image of chivalry, he survived years of brutal campaigning during the Third Crusade. But in 1199, he was struck by a single crossbow bolt while besieging a minor castle in France. The wound festered, turning black, and in days, the Lionheart, the man who had faced down Saladin, was reduced to delirium and death. To die of infection from a peasant's bolt was a humiliation as sharp as the wound itself. For rulers who carried the weight of divine mission, illness abroad seemed almost a betrayal. A sword could be parried, an enemy could be met in combat, but disease was faceless, unseen, and in the medieval mind, often interpreted as God's judgment. Did the fever mean their cause was unworthy? Did dysentery mean their sins outweighed their vows? For armies far from home, watching their kings collapse in sweat and weakness was as demoralizing as defeat in battle. The humiliations multiplied in death. Transporting royal bodies across seas was a grim ordeal. Sometimes, to preserve remains for the journey, kings were boiled in wine or vinegar so that only bones could be carried home, a process called mos teutonicus. Imagine the indignity. A monarch once hailed in silks and jewels, now reduced to bones packed into a chest, the body destroyed for convenience. Others were buried hastily abroad, their graves marked not by marble effigies, but by crude stones in foreign earth. The psychological weight of such endings cannot be overstated. A king was supposed to embody permanence, divine order, the strength of a nation. To see him broken by fever, wasted by dysentery, or carried home in pieces was to confront the frailty of monarchy itself. No crown could prevent bowels from loosening, skin from breaking out in sores, or lungs from filling with fluid. And for the people back home, news of such deaths arrived slowly, often wrapped in rumor. Whispers of humiliation spread. The Lionheart slain by a crossbowman, Louis rotting in dysentery, emperors drowned or fevered. These tales undermined the image of invincible kingship and turned crusading glory into a cautionary tale. In the end, the humiliation of dying far from home lay in both the manner and the meaning. Illness reduced kings to the same fragility as their lowest soldiers, stripped of dignity. Their final days witnessed not in palaces, but in sweltering camps of stench and despair. It was the cruelest contrast imaginable. Men who had set out to conquer the Holy Land, instead conquered by their own failing bodies, remembered as much for the humiliation of their deaths as for the splendor of their crowns. Among the great crusading kings and emperors, few deaths were as shocking, abrupt, and strange as that of Frederick I Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor. A man of immense stature and renown, Barbarossa embodied the majesty of medieval monarchy. Yet in 1190, as he marched eastward at the head of a vast army during the Third Crusade, his life ended not with the clash of armies, but with the cold pull of a river in Asia Minor. Barbarossa was no ordinary monarch. Crowned emperor in 1155, he had spent decades consolidating power across Germany and Italy, earning a reputation as both warrior and statesman. By the time of the Third Crusade, he was in his 60s, but still vigorous and determined. His presence lent weight to the expedition, for with him marched one of the largest armies of the age, tens of thousands of knights and foot soldiers answering the call to liberate Jerusalem after its capture by Saladin in 1187. The journey east was grueling. The imperial army marched through the Balkans, across Anatolia, enduring heat, thirst, and skirmishes with local forces. By June 1190, they had reached the Salif River, modern Guksu River, in Asia Minor. There, in a moment that still mystifies chroniclers, Barbarossa attempted to cross the swift current. Accounts vary. Some say he tried to ford the river on horseback, others that he sought to swim. Either way, disaster struck. The emperor fell into the water. Weighted down by armor and swept by the current, he drowned. Some versions claim he suffered a heart attack or stroke in the water. Others that the force of the current pulled him under before his men could rescue him. What is certain is that the most powerful monarch of the age, who had commanded empires and armies, perished suddenly, without warning, like any hapless traveler caught in a flood. The shock to his army was devastating. The vast imperial host, once the backbone of the crusade, dissolved into chaos. Some soldiers turned back, demoralized by the loss of their leader. Others pressed on, but without Barbarossa, their unity collapsed. His son, Frederick of Swabia, tried to salvage the expedition, but the momentum was gone. What had begun as one of the greatest crusading forces ended as a shadow of itself. Barbarossa's death carried both humiliation and legend. The emperor's body was dragged from the river, but the heat of Asia Minor made preservation difficult. His flesh reportedly began to rot quickly in the sun. Chroniclers describe a grim process. His body was boiled so that the bones might be carried separately in the tradition of Mos Teutonicus. Parts of him were buried in different places, flesh in Tarsus, bones in Antioch, and his heart in Tyre. The emperor, who had once been a symbol of unity, was now divided, his remains scattered across the east. In Europe, the news struck like thunder. The mighty Barbarossa, who had seemed larger than life, was gone, not slain by Saladin's armies, not cut down in heroic battle, but drowned in a river like an ordinary man. His death was seen by some as a divine judgment, by others as a cruel twist of fate. It robbed the Third Crusade of one of its strongest leaders, leaving Richard the Lionheart and Philip II of France to carry on without him. Over time, Barbarossa's drowning took on a mythical quality. In German folklore, he was said not to have died, but to sleep beneath a mountain, awaiting the day when he would rise again to restore his empire. This legend of the sleeping king softened the humiliation of his real death, transforming drowning into a mystical pause. Yet history remains clear. The emperor of Christendom, armored and crowned, was undone by the force of water, his end as sudden and ignoble as any peasant who slipped into a river. Thus, Frederick Barbarossa's death stands as one of the most exotic and mysterious of royal demises. It reminds us that kings, no matter how powerful, remained vulnerable to the simplest forces of nature. Few deaths fascinated and terrified medieval people as much as the idea of poison. Unlike the open chaos of battle or the visible wounds of execution, poison was hidden, secretive, and treacherous. It struck invisibly, often at a feast or in a goblet of wine, leaving behind rumors and suspicions more lasting than any evidence. And when kings and emperors died suddenly, whispers of poison almost always followed. One of the most infamous cases in England was that of King John, the much maligned monarch whose reign ended in 1216. According to chroniclers, John fell ill while campaigning in the east of England during a rebellion. Some said he suffered dysentery after gorging himself on peaches and cider. Others hinted at deliberate poisoning. His enemies were many: rebellious barons, foreign rivals, even his own courtiers. Though no proof was ever found, the suspicion clung to his name. To his contemporaries, it seemed fitting that a king so hated might have been betrayed at his table. Elsewhere, poison featured heavily in Byzantine politics, where palace intrigue and dynastic rivalry often ended with sudden deaths. The Byzantine Empire was famed for its sophisticated court and ruthless conspiracies, and chroniclers eagerly pointed to poison as a favored tool. Emperors like Constantine V and Romanos III were rumored to have died by poison drafts, often administered by rivals or even by their own spouses. In some cases, the tales were likely exaggerations meant to tarnish reputations. Yet the repetition of such stories shows how deeply people believed that poison was the chosen weapon of power struggles in Constantinople. The terror of poison lay not only in its secrecy, but in its plausibility. Food and drink were shared in abundance at courts, where feasts and banquets were central to royal life. To slip a powder into a goblet of wine or a tincture into a dish was far easier than confronting a king with sword or spear. Poison allowed the weak to strike down the strong, the servant to destroy the master, the wife to undo the husband. It was betrayal made tangible, a danger impossible to guard against completely. Medieval medicine, too, struggled to distinguish natural death from poisoning. Sudden illness, vomiting, or fevers might all be read as the work of poison, even if caused by spoiled food or infection. Chroniclers eager for drama often chose the darker explanation. The result was a culture where any unexpected royal death became fertile ground for rumor. The very fear of poison gave rise to elaborate rituals of protection. Monarchs employed tasters to sample their food before they ate. Charms and amulets were worn to ward off toxins. Some believed that certain gemstones, like emeralds, would shatter if poison were near. Others trusted in unicorn horns, actually narwhal tusks, sold at great price as antidotes to all venom. Kings carried these talismans with them, convinced that they could protect against the invisible threat of betrayal. Yet despite all these precautions, suspicion lingered. To die suddenly was to invite whispers of poison. To linger with illness was to invite whispers of sorcery. For rulers, there was no escape from the shadow of suspicion. Their power made them targets, and their courts were full of rivals. In that atmosphere, poison seemed always possible, always feared. Thus, the deaths of John of England, Byzantine emperors, and countless others became entwined with the legend of poison. Whether or not toxins truly ended their lives, their stories reveal a truth about the medieval mind: that the greatest terror was not death in battle or on the scaffold, but the slow sip of betrayal from a trusted cup. In the Middle Ages, few dangers cast a shadow over royal courts quite like the suspicion of poison. Unlike the clash of swords or the visible wounds of execution, poison was silent, invisible, and intimate. It slipped into the very rituals that bound rulers and their companions together: the shared meal, the raised goblet, the communion of trust. And because its effects were subtle, indistinguishable from common illness, it remained one of the most feared yet hardest to prove causes of death. The terror began with its invisibility. A dagger or a lance could be seen. A conspiracy could be uncovered. But poison struck without warning, hidden in the sweetness of wine or the richness of meat. To eat at a feast was to expose oneself, however unknowingly, to the risk of betrayal. This bred paranoia. Kings surrounded themselves with tasters, trusted servants who would sample dishes before they reached the royal table. Goblets were covered, meals guarded, kitchens watched, yet still suspicion lingered. Part of the dread came from medicine's limitations. Medieval physicians lacked the knowledge to distinguish reliably between natural sickness and deliberate poisoning. Vomiting, fever, weakness, convulsions, all could be signs of spoiled food, contaminated water, or the countless diseases that swept through medieval cities. Yet they could just as easily be attributed to poison. Chroniclers, eager to weave drama from royal deaths, often chose the latter explanation. Thus, rumor easily became legend. The lack of proof was itself a weapon. To accuse someone of poisoning was to brand them as treacherous, even if no evidence existed. In political struggles, the whisper of poison was enough to stain reputations. Queens and courtiers, rivals and enemies, were accused across centuries. Sometimes these accusations were tools of propaganda, shaping narratives to explain away inconvenient deaths. Other times, they were genuine suspicions, born of the helplessness of watching a king collapse suddenly at the feast. The fear of poison was magnified by its associations with secrecy and betrayal. A king might die honorably on a battlefield, struck down by a noble foe, but poison implied deceit, intimacy corrupted, and trust turned to treachery. To be poisoned was not merely to die, but to be betrayed in the most personal of spaces. It carried the shame of vulnerability, suggesting that a monarch who could not protect his own body could hardly protect his realm. Attempts at prevention reflected both science and superstition. Monarchs sought antidotes in herbs such as theriac, a concoction believed to ward off toxins. They carried amulets of precious stones thought to repel venom. Tales spread of unicorn horns, in truth, narwhal tusks, that would sweat or shatter if poison were near. Courts spent fortunes on these charms, their value rooted more in belief than in reality. Even the use of silverware, prized for its ability to tarnish in the presence of certain toxins, became linked with this constant fear. And still, deaths continued, and suspicions multiplied. When rulers fell suddenly, courtiers whispered of poisoned chalices. When they lingered in illness, suspicion shifted to slow-working toxins. In every case, poison served as explanation, not because it was proven, but because it spoke to the deep anxieties of the age. The invisible enemy was always more terrifying than the visible one. For this reason, poisoning became not just a method of murder, but a cultural symbol. It represented betrayal, deceit, and the fragility of kingship. A monarch could guard against armies with castles and knights, but against a few grains of powder in a cup of wine, there was little defense. The very impossibility of proof meant that poison was always present, if not in the food itself, then in the minds of those who sat trembling at the feast. The medieval fear of poison was not only reflected in the rumors surrounding royal deaths, but also in the elaborate defenses built against it. Kings and queens, surrounded by enemies both real and imagined, lived in a constant state of suspicion. Meals, once symbols of community and celebration, became arenas of danger. To eat was to gamble with life, unless one trusted in charms, antidotes, and rituals designed to ward off unseen toxins. One of the most widespread practices was the use of tasters. Before a monarch touched his food or drink, servants or courtiers sampled it first. If they survived, the meal was declared safe. Yet this system, while reassuring, was far from foolproof. Some poisons were said to work slowly, their effects delayed for hours or days, making the taster's survival no guarantee. Still, the ritual became essential, both as a precaution and as a symbolic display of loyalty. Beyond tasters, rulers turned to the realm of apothecaries and alchemists. The most famous antidote was theriac, a concoction with origins in ancient Greece. It contained dozens of ingredients, herbs, spices, even powdered viper flesh, and was touted as a cure-all against venom and toxins. Monarchs paid vast sums to secure vials of theriac, sometimes carrying them on their person like sacred relics. To sip theriac was to drink confidence itself, whether or not it had real efficacy. Precious stones, too, were believed to hold protective power. Emeralds were said to lose their luster in the presence of poison. Topaz and sapphire were thought to neutralize toxins. The most prized of all was the legendary unicorn horn. In reality, these were narwhal tusks brought from the Arctic by traders, but in Europe they were sold at exorbitant prices as proof against poison. Monarchs displayed them in treasuries and sometimes dipped them into goblets to test their contents. A single unicorn horn could be valued higher than castles, so deep was the faith in its power. Silverware also gained symbolic importance. Silver was thought to tarnish when touched by certain poisons, and so eating from silver plates or drinking from silver goblets became a defense against invisible threats. This belief lent practical longevity to silver's dominance at noble tables, even as it fed the sense that every meal was a battlefield of unseen dangers. Suspicion extended beyond the table. Some rulers refused to sleep without charms or amulets against poison and sorcery. Rings were inscribed with prayers or magical symbols. Herbal sachets were worn around the neck or sewn into garments. Even prayers and blessings became shields. Grace before meals took on added urgency when each bite could hold betrayal. Of course, the presence of such elaborate defenses only fed paranoia further. If so many precautions were needed, then surely the threat was real. Monarchs often distrusted even their closest companions. Queens were accused of poisoning kings. Brothers suspected brothers. Courtiers eyed one another with unease. Rumors of poisonings became as dangerous as poison itself, undermining trust and fueling endless cycles of suspicion. The irony is that most sudden royal deaths likely had natural causes: foodborne illness, infections, or strokes. But the medieval mind craved explanations that fit the drama of politics and the anxieties of betrayal. Poison offered both. A mysterious death was never just illness. It was treachery, cloaked in wine and served with meat. And the rituals of antidotes and charms, though powerless, offered kings the illusion of control in a world where their very meals felt unsafe. Thus, medieval antidotes and charms reveal more than superstition. They show a world where power was fragile, where betrayal was always a possibility, and where kings, despite crowns and armies, feared the invisible as much as the sword. In the Middle Ages, the death of a king was never simply an end. It was a story, a lesson, and a message for the living. Chroniclers, those careful weavers of words, often shaped royal deaths into moral exemplars. Brutality was not described merely for its horror, but for the meaning it could carry. In their hands, the suffering of rulers became both history and sermon. When Richard III was cut down in the mud at Bosworth, his body hacked and humiliated, chroniclers emphasized not just the violence, but the justice of it. His fall was presented as divine punishment for his alleged crimes. The disappearance of the princes in the Tower, his ruthless ambition, his betrayal of kin, the brutality of his death, stripped naked on horseback and buried hastily, was framed as God's judgment. In the narrative, his end was not random, but righteous. So too with Edward II. Tales of his imprisonment and rumored death by a red-hot poker, whether true or exaggerated, were given moral framing by chroniclers. To them, his supposed unnatural lusts and his failure as king justified an unnatural and horrifying punishment. Fact mattered less than lesson. His suffering became a warning that kings who failed in virtue or rule would face disgraceful ends. Even the slow death of Richard II by starvation was shaped into a tale of moral reckoning. Chroniclers wrote of his vanity, his extravagance, and his arrogance, only to show how all faded as he withered in captivity. His brutal death by hunger became a parable of pride reduced to emptiness, a reminder that earthly glory was fleeting, and that power could collapse as quickly as the body. Chroniclers often emphasize the physical grotesque to hammer their moral points. William the Conqueror's bloated corpse, which burst in the church during his funeral, was not recorded merely for shock. It was a reminder that pride swells the body, that even conquerors must rot, and that the greatest power ends in corruption. The vivid image of the bursting body served as a moral painting. Hubris undone by the inevitability of decay. This tendency reflected the medieval worldview. History was not seen as random or secular. It was divine drama. Every death carried meaning. Every tragedy echoed with judgment. If a king died in humiliation, it was because he had sinned. If he was struck down suddenly, it was because God had withdrawn his favor. Brutal deaths became proof of divine justice, woven into chronicles that were as much moral instruction as they were record. Of course, not all chroniclers were impartial. Many wrote under patrons with their own political agendas, shaping stories to suit victors. But even then, the framing was consistent. Brutality equaled punishment. Humiliation equaled justice. The more grotesque the detail, the stronger the lesson. Readers and listeners were meant to see not only the fragility of kings, but also the righteousness of God's order, which could bring even monarchs low. Thus, the brutal deaths of medieval royals lived on in words not as mere accidents or misfortunes, but as warnings. They were lessons written in blood and fire, meant to remind that power without virtue leads to ruin, and that no crown protects against the hand of divine justice. For medieval chroniclers and their audiences, death was never random. Every end carried a meaning, and brutal deaths, especially of kings, were almost always read as signs of divine punishment. The crown was believed to be bestowed by God, and with that gift came a responsibility to rule justly. To fail in that duty invited divine wrath. Thus, the violent, humiliating, or grotesque ends of monarchs became living sermons about the danger of abusing power. When Henry VI was murdered in the Tower, many chroniclers framed his fate not as a simple act of Yorkist politics, but as a sign that England itself had sinned. His frailty and piety, so ill-suited to kingship, were interpreted as punishments upon the nation, and his murder became a symbol of divine judgment upon both houses in the Wars of the Roses. His quiet, shadowed death resonated not just as political necessity, but as the echo of God turning his face away from a realm drenched in blood. Edward II's supposed agonizing death, described in lurid detail with the infamous red-hot poker, was another story shaped by the logic of punishment. Whether it truly happened or not mattered less than what it represented. Chroniclers insisted his unnatural end reflected his unnatural sins, his favoritism, his neglect of duty, and, in their eyes, his moral failings. The gruesomeness of the tale was meant to be proportional to the enormity of his faults. In this way, brutality was transformed into justice, however distorted by rumor or propaganda. Richard II's starvation in captivity, too, was framed as punishment. His downfall was presented as the inevitable consequence of his arrogance, extravagance, and disregard for his nobles. To wither slowly without food was not just a physical death, but a metaphor for his reign. Indulgence and pride leading to emptiness and collapse. Chroniclers delighted in the irony, showing how a king who had surrounded himself with excess was reduced to nothing by the absence of bread. Even the strange death of William the Conqueror carried the weight of divine symbolism. His funeral, where his swollen body burst in the church, was recounted with almost grotesque relish. Chroniclers read it as punishment for his pride, for the wars he waged, and for his harsh rule. The image of his body bursting in the sacred space of a church was a vivid lesson. No conqueror, however mighty, could escape corruption and God's justice. This narrative of divine punishment served multiple purposes. It reinforced the idea that kingship was sacred, granted by God, but also judged by him. It comforted subjects who could believe that tyrants or failed rulers would not escape justice, even if not at the hands of men. And it provided moral clarity, transforming chaos and tragedy into ordered meaning. In truth, many of these deaths were the result of political intrigue, illness, or misfortune. But the medieval world needed them to mean something more. To see them as divine punishment was to preserve the belief that God remained active in history, weighing kings as he weighed commoners, and bringing justice even to thrones. Thus, the brutal deaths of royals were not merely history. They became theology, woven into chronicles as proof that no crown could shield against the hand of divine retribution. For medieval minds, the spectacle of royal suffering was not just shocking. It was reassuring, proof that God's justice reached even the loftiest heights. Perhaps the most striking feature of these brutal royal deaths is their irony. Kings and queens lived lives wrapped in symbols of permanence and power: golden crowns, jewel-encrusted thrones, courts filled with ritual and pageantry. They were addressed as though divinely appointed, their authority presented as absolute. Yet again and again, their deaths revealed how fragile they truly were. Beneath the robes and armor lay flesh, weak and perishable, subject to the same humiliations as any peasant. Richard III, the warrior king who rode into Bosworth with banners flying, was hacked down like a common soldier. His body, stripped and thrown naked across a horse, mocked the trappings of majesty. The man who had once been surrounded by silks and ceremony ended his reign in mud and blood, as vulnerable as any man caught in the chaos of battle. The irony was sharp. The crown made him a target, but offered no protection. William the Conqueror's fate was just as symbolic. The man who had reshaped England with fire and sword, who imposed castles and law across the realm, could not command his own corpse. His swollen body burst in the silence of a church, filling the air with stench and horror. The conqueror of kingdoms could not conquer decay. Chroniclers seized on this irony as lesson. The stronger the king in life, the more grotesque his exposure in death. Edward II's rumored death by red-hot poker epitomized fragility in another way. A king, imprisoned and abandoned, was stripped not only of dignity, but of humanity itself. His supposed end turned him into an object of ridicule, his body weaponized against him. Whether fact or invention, the story endured because it captured a deep truth, that even kings, once disgraced, could be made fragile to the point of farce. Richard II's starvation reveals the same irony in quieter tones. A monarch who once surrounded himself with luxury and splendor was reduced to a man wasting away in silence, his body thinning as the days passed. A ruler who dined on gold plates died because he was denied the simplest sustenance. His fragility was absolute, and the contrast with his former grandeur made the irony sting. Even deaths abroad bore this cruel symmetry. Louis IX, saintly and pious, dreamed of crusading glory, yet ended not in triumph, but in dysentery, weakened on a foreign shore. Frederick Barbarossa, emperor of half of Europe, drowned like an ordinary man swept into a current. Their ends were almost parables, power laid low by the smallest, simplest forces. What unites these stories is the exposure of the body. In life, kings embodied authority, distant, armored, elevated. In death, their bodies betrayed them, bloated, bleeding, wasted, or humiliated. Power evaporated, leaving only fragility. Chroniclers dwelt on this irony because it drove home a message audiences craved: that kings were mortal, that their grandeur was temporary, and that no crown could shield them from decay. For listeners and readers, this irony comforted as much as it unsettled. It reassured the powerless that the mighty, too, would fall. It reminded subjects that God's justice spared no one, and it offered a truth that continues to echo: that the greatest irony of power is how swiftly it collapses when measured against the frailty of flesh. And so, as we come to the end of these stories, of kings and queens brought low by violence, betrayal, illness, and humiliation, we return to a gentler place. The tales have been heavy, filled with suffering and spectacle, but beneath them lies a quieter truth. All power fades, All crowns slip, and all lives, however grand, are mortal. Think of William the Conqueror, whose bursting corpse reminded all that even conquerors rot. Think of Richard III, stripped and broken in the mud, his crown lost to another hand. Think of Edward II, imprisoned and disgraced, or Richard II, withering away in hunger. Their ends were brutal, yes, but also strangely ordinary. They died as all men die, their bodies frail, their strength gone, their crowns powerless against decay. The chroniclers shaped these deaths into lessons of morality, symbols of divine judgment, or tales of irony. Yet as we listen now, centuries later, we can hear something softer within them. The noise of the battlefield fades, the stench of the sickbed drifts away, and what remains is the reminder that kings and peasants alike share the same fate. Power may elevate for a time, but death levels all. This reflection does not need to be grim. Instead, it can be soothing. For if the mighty fall, then our own small struggles are part of the same great pattern. If even kings with crowns of gold could not escape fragility, then perhaps our own imperfections are easier to accept. Their lives were filled with burden, expectation, and danger. Our lives, though humbler, are also freer. So now, let the brutality of these tales recede like a storm passing over the hills. The thunder of battle grows quiet. The flickering torchlight of dark prisons fades. The kings and queens we have spoken of are long gone. Their bones turned to dust, their crowns tarnished. What lingers is the calm of history itself, distant, softened by time, like echoes carried on the wind. Take a breath. Let the weight of their stories settle, not as fear, but as perspective. You are here, in this moment, safe and still, while their tragedies remain behind the veil of centuries. Their lives and deaths can remind us not only of human fragility, but of the peace we may choose now, in the present. As you rest, imagine the great halls of history emptying, the torches guttering out, and silence filling the spaces where once kings fought and died. The noise fades, leaving only calm. Let that calm surround you now, because in the end, every story of brutality carries the same conclusion. All things pass, even suffering. The kings we have spoken of endured pain, but their pain ended. Their crowns were taken, their lives concluded, but the world moved on, and in that truth is comfort. And now, so may you. Let the tales fall away, and let the silence close around you like a soft cloak. Breathe deeply. Rest gently. The kings are gone, the stories told,